This meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee will come to order. Ask members to please take seats. Today we're going to vote on 12 judicial nominees and one bill, S-2992, the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, introduced by Competition Subcommittee Chair Amy Klobuchar and Ranking Member Chuck Grassley, co-sponsored by myself, Senator Graham, Blumenthal, Kennedy, Booker, Hirono, and Hawley. This bipartisan bill addresses the tactics that dominant tech platforms have used to limit choice by consumers and exclude competitors. I'll certainly have more on this bill, turn to it on the agenda. We also have a new bill on the agenda, S-2710, Open App Markets Act, introduced by Senator Blumenthal and Blackburn, co-sponsored Klobuchar, Graham, Booker, Kennedy, Hirono, Hawley, and myself. S-2710 is being listed on the agenda for the first time and is going to be held over. Many members on this committee on both sides of the aisle have been working on these bills for a long, long time. They've been carefully crafted to address anti-competitive practices by dominant tech companies. I look forward to debating and voting on them. It's I think, a relatively new undertaking by this committee and one that is overdue. I commend the senators on both sides of these issues. I think the importance and relevance of the Judiciary Committee is being tested by this debate today, and I'm sure we will rise to the challenge. I understand several members have asked to delay today's markup of S-2992. I think we have to move forward. We have limited opportunities to consider important legislation and a lot to do. I'm going to try to be as sensitive as I can be to fairness on both sides, naturally. After the Senate bill was introduced originally, the Competition Subcommittee held another hearing on December 15th. 3 witnesses testified, 8 senators attended. In short, there has been opportunity for members to review this bill and debate it. Consistent with the rules of the committee, S-2992 was added to the agenda on January 10th, 10 days ago, so members have had notice that it was coming. The manager's amendment circulated on Tuesday, and obviously members have had an opportunity to review it because 107 amendments have been filed, including 82 from one senator. We're going to move forward with consideration of S-2992 today. Now we're going to turn to today's agenda, and I want to note the run of show. I will speak about 2 of the nominees to be considered: Judge Allison Nathan, Second Circuit, Dale Ho, Southern District of New York, being turned over before turning it over to Ranking Member Grassley. We'll then proceed to vote on the nominees in order that they're listed, beginning with Judge Nathan, concluding with Ms. Trong. As we've done at previous markups, I ask members to await to comment on any particular nominee until they're called, and then at the end of the nominees process, we will consider S-2992. First on the agenda this morning will be Allison Nathan, Second Circuit Court of Appeals, highly qualified, Cornell Law School, clerked for Judge Betty Fletcher of the Ninth Circuit, and then on the Supreme Court for Justice John Paul Stevens. 10 years she served with distinction in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. Authored over 1,500 opinions, presided over 45 trials that have gone to verdict or judgment, set by designation on the Second Circuit on several occasions. During her hearing, she was repeatedly asked what the party not in power in the White House always asks for: personal opinions on issues. Some of my colleagues have been as disappointed as we were as Democrats under the Trump administration that Judge Nathan and others have withheld personal opinions on many issues. That's happened in the past, so the anxiety being felt by some Republican members was shared by Democrats when the shoe was on the other foot. There should not be one standard for Republican nominees and another standard for Democratic nominees. Judge Nathan found unanimously well qualified by the ABA. Dale Ho, Southern District of New York. He's a highly skilled litigator with a significant appellate practice. Princeton and Yale Law School, clerked in the Southern District of New York for Judge Barbara Jones, New York Court of Appeals. Has spent the majority of his career as a civil rights lawyer, experience in long-running, complex civil matters, and in proceedings for preliminary relief. I'm not going to read this because I want to get into the business of the day. I will tell you that Mr. Ho was called to answer why he posted certain things on social media. And he said, and I quote, "I very much regret the tone that I've taken on social media from time to time. In my role as advocate, I've pushed the envelope to break through, but I regret the times that I've crossed the line with overheated rhetoric. There are some members on this committee who believe in redemption and some who don't. I'm one who does. I hope that my general positive attitude toward redemption is going to be proven right by Mr. Ho and many of the others that I've supported in the past." With that, I'll turn to Senator Grassley.
Yeah, we want to hold over 2710. Senator Klobuchar and I, along with 10 of our Senate colleagues from both sides of the aisle, introduced the bill that we're taking up today, addressing the growing concerns with competition on big tech platforms. This legislation prevents dominant big tech platforms from anti-competitively preferencing their own product or discriminating against competing products. This will ensure that there is robust competition on dominant tech platforms. Our bill will help level the playing field for small businesses and entrepreneurs that rely on dominant big tech platforms to reach consumers. I want to stress that this bill is not meant to break up big tech or destroy the products and services they offer that many of us, including myself, enjoy and use. Rather, the goal of the bill is to prevent conduct that stifles competition while ensuring that pro-consumer innovations and offerings are still available. The Antitrust Subcommittee held 4 hearings over the past year that directly explored all of these issues, including a recent hearing in December that focused on the non-discrimination competition issues that this bill addresses. The manager's amendment incorporates a whole lot of feedback that we received from both senators and stakeholders. Among other things, the manager's amendment addresses national security concerns by clarifying that the legislation doesn't require data to be shared with bad actors. It clarifies that a business can require user consent before sharing data with a third-party company. It ensures that foreign companies, including Chinese big tech companies such as TikTok, are subject to the same rules of the road. It provides that enforcement action can only be brought in federal district court. These are just a few of the improvements that the manager's amendment makes to the bill, so I hope everyone can support these amendments. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for putting the bills on the agenda. I look forward to voting favorably on this legislation and urge all of my colleagues to do the same. I'd also like to return to our discussion of last week's executive meeting about this committee's oversight. The chairman stated this, quote, "We've had an oversight hearing and we'll have more with Merrick Garland. For the last 4 years, unfortunately, in the previous administration, we didn't. But I think we're trying to resume our position as the Oversight Committee, Active Oversight Committee for the Judiciary and the Department of Justice," end quote. Without objection, I'd like to introduce a list of oversight hearings that I led as chairman of this committee during 2017 and 18. The list consists of 19 full committee oversight hearings that were related to the Justice Department, its components, and the judiciary. It also includes 7 subcommittee oversight hearings. That's 26 oversight hearings. The list would be longer if I included legislative hearings related to the Justice Department. And the list would be much longer if I included oversight hearings related to the executive branch department and agencies beyond the Justice Department. Clearly, when I was chairman, this committee engaged in robust oversight of the Trump administration. There are many ways that this committee can and should engage in bipartisan oversight of this administration. As just one example, this committee should conduct oversight hearing of the Drug Enforcement Agency. Last November, Senator Durbin and I authored and sent oversight letters to the Drug Enforcement Agency. That letter asked that they answer for their significant failures on overseeing foreign operations and foreign law enforcement units. Our respective staffs have been in contact about this. The Drug Enforcement Administration still hasn't responded to our letter. I understand this to be a bipartisan issue that warrants attention. I'd also like to return to the list of outstanding letters to the Justice Department that my staff sent your staff last week. The list contained outstanding letters from Republican members. You requested this list at our December 9th, 2021 executive business meeting. There's still no movement from your side with respect to the next steps with the Justice Department. I strongly encourage this committee to quickly assert its oversight equities on that department. As it currently stands, by any metric, Attorney General Garland has failed to meet the responsiveness standard required of this committee, or even that he promised us. We also have a number of judicial nominees up today. I'm just going to speak on one. I also wanted to explain my vote on Dale Ho. Mr. Ho has extremely controversial legal issues. They include supporting interpreting the law based upon his personal lived experience and applying the Bill of Rights differently based upon community a person is in. These views are far outside the mainstream. Mr. Ho has repeatedly shown that he's a partisan activist who lacks the judicial temperament to serve as a federal judge. He has spent much of his professional life on Twitter and on cable TV attacking conservatives and the states, the courts, and the people with whom he disagrees. So I'll vote against him. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. And of course, your unanimous consent request will be granted to put the information in the record. Secondly, I would like to tell you on the issue of oversight and response by the Department of Justice, I want to thank you for causing us to take an inventory of letters sent, and I have admonished my staff for the unacceptable fact that Senator Grassley has sent the Department of Justice more than twice the letters that I've been sending. We're going to try to pick up our pace on the majority side to make sure that we keep up with your letters and make sure that there's a timely response to all of them. I also note that the importance of today's hearing is underlined by the fact that Senator Cotton has brought his top staffer to join him this morning, and we're expecting good advice for Senator Cotton through the hearing. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman.
Why, certainly. Senator Kennedy.
I appreciate the Attorney General's letter. What does that mean?
No, we have not received a specific letter that I'm referring to, but we have been in communication, as was suggested at the last meeting, with the Department of Justice. What we are doing is reviewing outstanding correspondence, and part of the problem, Senator, to be very honest with you, is many times there is a response and it's disappointing to the senator, either the conclusion or the contents. So we're trying to balance these things, but I am well aware of this committee's importance and oversight, and it includes not just the formal hearings, but also the communications between senators and the department.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I know you're doing the best you can, and I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but this is the same song, 100th verse. This is a bipartisan problem. It didn't just happen under this administration. It happened under the last administration and the one before that. And as I said last time, at some point, patience ceases to be a virtue. And I would like to see, not just to Senator Grassley's letters, because he's an important person, but all the rest of us have letters as well. And I would like to ask respectfully, first I'd like to get a list of everybody's letters that haven't been answered, and the date, and who they were sent to. And then at the appropriate time, I don't know if you'll put it on the agenda, but I'm going to make a motion that we start subpoenaing people.
I've been advised that under the previous administration, they didn't respond to any minority letters.
Well, that's why I said it's bipartisan.
Yes.
And if some of them are still in office or still in the bureaucracy, I want to be an equal opportunity a-hole on this.
Complainer.
Complainer, yeah. We need to go after, and I just don't think I think we're getting rope-a-doped here, and I think we need to
Well,
start issuing subpoenas.
I hope it doesn't come to that. I will tell you that I don't believe we're being stonewalled. There is communication, yeah, and we should have a more fulsome discussion about the actual numbers, and I think that's reasonable.
Well, it is, and look, I'm not fussing at you, but I've learned the hard way up here. You got to watch what people do, not what they say. And I'm just saying that we need to bring this to a head, and I think the way to do it is ask when we're going to get responses, and if we don't get responses, you know, I may only get one vote, but I'm prepared to bring a motion to start subpoenaing people.
I'm going to share the list that I talked about this morning with everybody, because you're entitled to it, and there's no secret about it.
I'd like to proceed to the nominations, and the standard that I've used before, I'll try again today. We're going to go to each individual nomination, and if any member wishes to speak in reference to that nominee, please make sure that I see your hand and give you that opportunity. But we're going to go through these in order as they've been filed. We'll begin with Judge Nathan. Does anyone seek recognition to speak on that nomination? So on favorably reporting the nomination of Allison Nathan to be U.S. Circuit Judge for the Second Circuit, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy. Aye. Ms. Feinstein. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Mr. Booker. Aye. Mr. Padilla. Aye. Mr. Ossoff. Aye. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
This is Nathan.
Mr. Cornyn. No. Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Cruz.
No by proxy.
Mr. Sass.
No by proxy.
Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Cott. No. Mr. Kennedy.
Aye.
Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mrs. Blackburn. No. Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 13, the nays are 9.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. Victoria Calvert, nominated to be on the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. The clerk, is anyone seek recognition? Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've had the pleasure of speaking with several of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle about Ms. Calvert's nomination. And as we've discussed, she's highly qualified, committed to upholding the rule of law without fear or favor or ideology. And I would humbly ask my colleagues on both sides to vote to report her favorably to the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This will be a good test of your humility. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker. Aye. Mr. Padilla. Aye. Mr. Ossoff. Aye. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
I by proxy.
Mr. Cornyn. No. Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Cruz.
No by proxy.
Mr. Sass.
No by proxy.
Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton.
No.
Mr. Kennedy.
Aye.
Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mrs. Blackburn. Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 13, the nays are 9.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. Next is John Chun, nominated to the Western District of Washington. Does anyone seek recognition? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Kuhn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Harona. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Assad. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
I vote proxy.
Mr. Cornick. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz.
No by proxy.
Mr. Sass.
No by proxy.
Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mrs. Blackburn. Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 12, the nays are 10.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. The next is Sarah Garrity, nominated to the Northern District of Georgia. Does anyone seek recognition? Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, an outstanding nominee for the Northern District of Georgia. And again, I've spoken with several of my Republican colleagues about her high qualifications, her commitments to rule of law, and her outstanding track record, and humbly ask the committee to move forward and report her nomination favorably. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If no one else seeks recognition, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Ms. Harona. Mr. Booker. Aye. Mr. Padilla. Aye. Mr. Assad. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
I vote proxy.
Mr. Cornick. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz.
No by proxy.
Mr. Sass.
No by proxy.
Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton. No. Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mrs. Blackburn. Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 12, the nays are 10.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. Next is Dale Ho, nominated for the Southern District of New York. Does anyone seek recognition to speak on this nomination? Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My concerns with Mr. Ho began prior to his hearing, when I started reviewing his bio and reviewing things that he said and done and written over the years. One of the things that initially flagged my attention as I was preparing for his hearing was really a characterization that he had given himself, in which he had described himself as, quote, a wild-eyed sort of leftist who was accused sometimes of seeing racism everywhere I look. Wasn't sure what to make of that, but I figured I could get to know him a little bit more during his hearing. My attention while preparing for that hearing was also drawn to some things that he posted on social media, things that he posted in response to a series of tweets that I had about a year and a half ago posted as part of a thread talking about the difference between a democracy and a constitutional republic like ours. In response to that, he posted something interesting. It didn't bother me at all that he was taking a different position than I was. I like and respect that kind of open, honest debate. What troubled me was something he said in it, something he said about the Constitution that concerned me. Here's what he wrote in response to that. He says, quote, "The mask is off." And he followed that one up by saying, translation, meaning translation of my tweets, talking about the difference between rank unadorned democracy on the one hand and a constitutional republic like ours. He said, translation, if we can't maintain, speaking as if he were a Republican, speaking for and on behalf of Republican office holders, Republicans in the Senate, for example. Translation, if we can't maintain minoritarian rule despite the Electoral College, Senate malapportionment, extreme partisan gerrymandering, and strict conditions on voting, then we'll rely on a 6-3 SCOTUS to block an elected Democratic agenda. He's a little vitriolic, I get that, but more than anything, I was confused and very curious about what he meant by one phrase in particular. The phrase in question was Senate malapportionment. As I explained to him at the hearing, wasn't quite sure what he meant by that. It's not a term that I've heard a lot, and I've never really stopped to consider what it could have meant, but I started wondering when I read that, is this someone who disagrees with a principle very deeply rooted in our Constitution? That is that every state, regardless of its size, regardless of its population, will receive 2 votes in the United States Senate. It's very important to our republic. The Constitutional Convention could never have succeeded. Our republic could never have sprouted, much less flourished into what it's become without that feature. And I suspected when you refer to Senate malapportionment, it sounded to me like he might be trashing that constitutional principle. Wanted to know if he was in fact doing that, and if he was, whether he cared to retract that, whether he realized that this is the one feature in the Constitution you can't change. Under Article 5 of the Constitution, which outlines the procedures required to amend the Constitution, it identifies one remaining feature of the Constitution that cannot be amended. That is the feature of equal suffrage, equal representation by the states in the Senate. You cannot take that away. Not by amendment. You can't do it at all without the state's consent. And no state, of course, would ever consent to that, so it's off the table. Anyway, I was curious about what his position was. I suspected he might back down and say, yeah, I shouldn't use that term. Now, I didn't exactly react that way. I'll get back to that in a moment. When I asked him about it, he gave me a series of vague, broad answers, just saying, well, you know, I wasn't really sure what you were asking about. I wasn't sure what you, referring to me, meant by your tweet. And then he started talking about fears that he had at the time, concerns that he had about whether Republicans would accept the ultimate outcome of elections. Now, it still didn't strike me as an appropriate phrase for that. It didn't match up. And I asked him, is there something you meant specifically by Senate malapportionment? He wouldn't engage. He basically just restated his broader concern. Oh, I didn't like the fact that I believed that Republicans were going to challenge the results of elections. Gave him 2 or 3 opportunities with 2 or 3 separate lines of inquiry. What did you mean by Senate malapportionment? What does that mean? Instead of answering that question forthrightly, he apologized for, quote unquote, misinterpreting my tweet. I was kind of shocked by his lack of candor, because he was very clearly not engaging on this as I was asking him to do. By the way, he owed me no apology for misinterpreting my tweet. It was nice that he did it, but it really wasn't my concern. Somebody can misinterpret my tweet. It doesn't bother me in the least. Somebody can even engage in fiery rhetoric, and I may well vote for that person when it comes time to confirm. But he never answered it. Now, I could have perhaps decided that this was just somebody who, in the heat of the moment, threw in a term that he didn't understand, that he didn't know. But I dug in a little bit more when I realized that he had utterly refused to engage at all in any effort to answer my question about what he meant by Senate malapportionment. And I discovered that terms like malapportionment, when referring to the United States Senate, were not new to him. He knew exactly what he was doing. For example, when he was speaking at a National Civic Leadership Training Summit in 2018, Mr. Ho claimed that the United States has, quote, obviously lots of practices that are anti-democratic, that entrench, in some ways, minority rule in this country, and I'm talking about things like, you know, the Senate, the Electoral College, and the maldistribution of political power that results from these institutions. Just the next year, the year following that, in some remarks he delivered to UCLA Law School, Mr. Ho lamented that, quote, by 2040, 70% of the country, if current population trends maintain, will reside in just 15 states. Put that another way, that means 30% of the country will have 70 seats in the Senate and outsized representation in the Electoral College, close quote. As if that weren't enough for him, enough of the condemning of the constitutional order put in place in our founding document, you know, the one that we've all sworn an oath to uphold and protect and defend. He then went on to say, quote, it's incumbent upon folks who care about voting rights to see these connections between restrictions on the ability to participate and other kinds of attacks on fair representation on voters of color. My point is this. We absolutely do have a lot of people with a lot of diverse backgrounds, politically, ideologically, and otherwise, come before this committee. I don't expect everyone I vote for to share my particular views politically. I don't expect everyone who comes before this committee to even advocate for the same jurisprudential approach that I think is ideal. But I don't think it's too much to ask that people that we've been asked to confirm to a lifetime appointment as an Article III judge should not be expressing open hostility and contempt for the Constitution, the source of the authority by which they're appointed, the source of the authority by which they will operate as Article III judges. This is open contempt and hostility toward the Constitution. And it's not like it's just some obscure provision either. This was essential to the compromise of 1787, a compromise that apparently he's still not settled on. Now, I believe in redemption, very much so.
Good.
That's why I've voted for a lot of people who have said things that I consider suboptimal. This one is different. This guy refused even to answer my question. He was evasive to the point of being dishonest. I cannot and I will not vote for someone who at once expresses repeatedly contempt for the U.S. Constitution and then secondly, lies about it when brought before this committee under oath. I strongly oppose Mr. Ho's confirmation, and I encourage my colleagues to do so. Thank you.
Anyone else seek recognition? If not, the clerk will call the roll. Senator Cruz,
Yes.
welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to echo the comments of Senator Lee about Dale Ho. You know, Senator Lee went through erudite constitutional history of this country, laying out the problems with Mr. Ho. I'm going to talk about something more fundamental. Everyone in this committee knows the sorts of people that should be judges. We know the temperament that we expect of judges. And everyone in this committee knows Dale Ho doesn't have that temperament. You know, I will confess to some frustration sitting here. because whatever I say, whatever Senator Lee says, whatever any other Republican says, not going to matter. Every Democrat on this committee is going to vote for this nominee, as you have for every radical nominee that the Biden administration has put forward. Whether it was the number 3 position at the Department of Justice, one of the leading advocates for abolishing the police, whether it was the head of the Civil Rights Division, one of the leading advocates for abolishing the police, whether it was Rachel Rollins, a district attorney who refused to prosecute the law and issued a memo instructing her prosecutors not to prosecute violent crime. We now see violent crime and homicide skyrocketing across the country. And yet it doesn't matter what we say. Every Democrat just, I will commend the Democratic senators for party discipline. We even saw last week 44 Democrats willing to filibuster to prevent sanctions on Russia while Russia is preparing to invade Ukraine. Never mind the irony that this is simultaneously while Democrats are giving speeches calling the filibuster a Jim Crow relic while they're filibustering, which is a level of gymnastic flexibility remarkable even for the United States Senate to be doing it simultaneously. But when it comes to, and I would note, by the way, in the previous administration, we had a Republican administration. Republicans in the Senate rejected numerous nominees. If there were concerns with nominees, there are members of this committee, there are members of the Senate who said no. Democrats don't say no. It doesn't matter what wild-eyed loon this White House nominates. Like lemmings, Democratic senators vote for him. And by the way, when I say wild-eyed loon, you would think that's some hyperbole. Well, I can tell you how Mr. Ho describes himself. He didn't quite say wild-eyed loon. He described himself as a, quote, wild-eyed leftist. That's his own self-assessment. Not only that, here's what he wrote in his church newsletter. Quote, Dale, do you do what you do because you want to help people? That'd be good. Or because you hate conservatives? And here's his answer. Anger can in fact be a tremendous source of power. Now, I want you to pretend for a second that you're a New Yorker who's a conservative. They do actually exist. They may be in witness protection, but they do actually exist. You're a conservative in New York, and you find yourself in Judge Ho's courtroom, someone who describes himself, he writes in his church newspaper how much he hates conservatives. Are you going to get a fair shake? Look, the Senate is a place where the shoe is always on the other foot. Turnabout's fair play. So I'm just going to ask Democrats here to think for a second how you would feel if a Republican president nominated someone to be a judge who describes his motivation is that he hates liberals. How would you feel if you appeared as a lawyer in a courtroom of a judge who says, I hate liberals, and not only that, that anger is his source of motivation? Would you expect a fair shake? You know, all of us have known lawyers who want to be judges. We've all known lawyers who've spent years hoping to be a judge, trying to build the kind of career where they could be nominated to be a judge. That's not Mr. Ho. Mr. Ho, in the last 2 years, has managed to personally insult on Twitter Senator Blackburn, Senator Cotton, Senator Hawley, Senator Lee, and Senator Cornyn. I have to admit, I feel kind of offended that I got left out of his insults. Apparently, I'm not doing my job well enough. I don't know of another nominee to this committee who has gone out of his way to personally insult as many members of this committee. That's extraordinary. You know what that isn't? That isn't a lawyer who's hoping to be a judge, who's trying to live a careful life, who's trying to be buttoned down, who's trying to avoid the sorts of things that are bad to confirmation. And you know what? The frustrating thing as I say this is not a Democrat on this committee cares at all. In just a few minutes, you're all like Pravda going to go, yeah. And the turnaround, there'll be another Republican president. And just wait and see. I hope it doesn't happen. But you may see a judicial nominee who's personally insulted and ridiculed 3, 4, 5, 6 Democratic members of this committee by name just a year or two before they were nominated. Will that piss you off? It should. I actually would hope the Republicans on this committee would show enough dedication to principle to exercise advise and consent. I don't understand why Democrats don't do that. Look, Republicans in the Senate are very proud of the judges that were nominated and confirmed to the court. But when there were people who were concerned, everyone in this committee remembers John Kennedy's withering cross-examination of the poor fellow in this committee, that it will be taught in confirmation schools 100 years from now not to go through that. Is there even one Democrat willing to say to anyone, how about the guy that describes himself as a wild-eyed leftist who is motivated by his hatred for conservatives and demonstrates it by going out of his way to insult multiple conservatives on this committee? That'd be a good place to start. I promise you won't be excluded from the Democratic Club when you go party at night. But the Senate has to have an actual independent voice and not be a rubber stamp for radicals. And I do know that members who serve on this committee, at least when you say yes to serving on this committee, part of it is because you believe in the importance of an independent judiciary. You believe in the importance of judges that have judicial temperament, that will be fair, that will give you a fair shake, whether they are of your political stripe or the opposite. I just ask you again, how would you feel about appearing as a lawyer, or even worse, as a litigant, as a party? How would you feel as a criminal defendant in a courtroom where the judge in black robes has said he hates liberals, and that he also said that righteous indignation can provide a sense of moral clarity? You know, I don't want my judges with righteous indignation having a sense of moral clarity and deciding that half of the country needs to be punished. You're comfortable with that because you don't describe yourselves as conservatives. But you know what? A judge is supposed to be fair to everyone. So I ask you, would you feel you would get a fair shake from a judge who said, I hate liberals, that righteous indignation gives me clarity, that anger can be a tremendous source of power? Okay, Judge. That's not how our judiciary is supposed to work.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I'd like to enter into the record a letter from Robert Smith, dated November 24th of 2021. Mr. Smith, in that letter, describes himself as a man who served as judge of the New York Court of Appeals, the state's highest court, from 2004 to 2014. Dale Ho was my clerk, he writes, in 2006 and 2007, and we've remained in touch since then. Mr. Smith says, I was appointed to the bench by a Republican governor and often considered a conservative judge. And he writes, Dale Ho, as his career path makes clear, has strong progressive convictions. This could easily have made for some tension in our chambers, but it did not. Not because Dale was shy in expressing his views, but because he knew how to do so appropriately and respectfully. Former Judge Smith writes, he's not one of those people, of whom there are all too many today, who think of members of a different political tribe as the enemy. If he were, I do not think he would have clerked for me and remained my friend since. It's a pretty positive letter and addresses the charges that were made. Members are allowed, of course, to make their own, draw their own conclusions. If no one else seeks...
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cornyn, of course.
Mr. Chairman, I won't try to improve on the excellent comments made by Senator Lee and Senator Cruz, but I just want to point out some of the other criticism that Mr. Ho has directed not at members of the committee, but at the members of the Supreme Court of the United States. And his belief that apparently the Constitution does not apply equally to every American, but should be applied preferentially to groups that he favors. The first case I want to mention is the NAACP versus Alabama case, which establishes the important principle under the First Amendment that we have a freedom to associate with whomever we please, regardless of political ideology. You'll recall that case, the state of Alabama sought to identify the members of the of NAACP members, presumably not for benign purposes. Mr. Ho, after the Supreme Court rendered a decision dealing with the issue of whether a PAC had to identify contributors to that PAC, he suggested that the First Amendment should only apply to protect advocacy groups from compelled disclosure laws when such laws are applied to minority or dissident groups. We understand what a minority is. I don't know what a dissident, if you restrict it to dissident groups, I presume that would span the political spectrum. There are dissidents, I assume, on the right and on the left. But the idea that the freedom of association under the First Amendment would only apply to some Americans and not others is a stunning position. Likewise, when the Supreme Court of the United States decided the scope of the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, and established that it was an individual right, he said that the Supreme Court's decision was cavalier. And he said that local communities ought to be able to decide for themselves the scope of the Constitution. Again, not a what I would call a mainstream view among the legal profession. The other thing that troubles me about Mr. Ho is his comment. Senator Cruz alluded to this when Vanita Gupta was nominated to her position at the Justice Department. She originally came in here and said that basically attacked law enforcement on the basis that systemic racism tainted law enforcement. And then I remember specifically when I pressed her about systemic racism, that means we're all racist, including you. She said, well, it's structural racism. Mr. Ho tweeted a comment where he said that structural racism is a feature of every American institution, and that we all have implicit biases. He said that's not controversial, that's the truth. I'm not sure whether Mr. Ho was asked about his biases or not. Actually, his biases are not implicit, they're explicit, as Senator Cruz did an excellent job of pointing out. So whether it's a church, a synagogue, a mosque, it's the current occupant of the White House, members of the United States Senate, the House of Representatives, whether it's law enforcement or other first responders, Mr. Ho believes that they're all biased. I think someone with those views certainly is entitled to express those views under the First Amendment, and I respect his right to express those views, but I believe that his lack of a judicial temperament disqualifies him from this nomination and this position. And so I will be voting against the nomination.
Senator Kennedy.
Mr. Chairman, you know, freedom of speech is meaningless if you can't express yourself. And freedom of speech is meaningless if you can't say what you believe. And certainly the nominee has done that, and he has every right in the world to do it. But I think everybody knows in this room that the nominee is more of an advocate and an activist than an impartial arbiter. We had that a handful of times under the last administration. And we dealt with it. And sometimes it wasn't particularly easy. I voted against one of the president's nominees on the floor of the Senate, not because I thought he'd be impartial. He came from the White House counsel's office directly to the D.C. Circuit. I voted against him because I thought he had a conflict. I came damn close to having my office moved to Richmond, but I'd do it again. And I really would like to ask my Democratic friends to dig deep on this one and think about it. We'll regret this. Mr. Ho does not have the judicial temperament to wield the kind of power that a federal judge has. He needs to go run for Congress or run for the Senate, but he doesn't need to be on the federal bench. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator,
I'll be brief. You can't really build on what Mike and Ted said, but just to echo John, colleagues, it isn't just votes that were taken in public. A lot of us killed a lot of nominees in the last administration before it got to the stage. Like, we didn't have a majority that was as thin as yours at 50-50, but we killed nominees because they were this crazy before they were public. It is a bizarre vote y'all are about to take. This guy should not be on the bench, and you all know it. And I'm just perplexed as to why we're having this vote today.
no one else seeks recognition. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Coons. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
No by proxy.
Mr. Cornyn. No. Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Sass. No. Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mrs. Blackburn. No. Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 11, the nays are 11.
The committee has recorded a tied vote on Mr. Ho's nomination to the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York pursuant to Section 3, subsection 1A of the Senate Resolution 27 of the 117th Congress. I will transmit to the Secretary of the Senate a notice of this vote. Under Section 3, subsection 1B of that resolution, either the majority or minority leader may then make a motion to discharge. Next nominee is Charlotte Sweeney for the District Court of Colorado. Does anyone seek recognition to speak on this nomination? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla. Aye. Mr. Ossoff. Aye. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
No by proxy.
Mr. Cornyn. No. Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Cruz. No. Mr. Sass. No. Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mrs. Blackburn.
No by proxy.
Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 11, the nays are 11.
The committee has recorded a tie vote on Ms. Sweeney's nomination to be U.S. District Judge for the District of Colorado pursuant to Section 3, subsection 1A of the Senate Resolution 27 of the 117th Congress. I will transmit to the Secretary of the Senate a notice of this tie vote, and under Section 3, subsection 1B of that resolution, either the majority or minority leader may then make a motion to discharge the nomination. Next is Judge Hernan Vera for the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California. Does anyone seek recognition? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye.
Ms. Klobuchar.
Aye.
Mr. Coons. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Asa. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
No by proxy.
Mr. Corning.
No.
Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Sass. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mrs. Blackburn.
No by proxy.
Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 11, the nays are 11.
The committee has recorded a tie vote on Judge Vera's nomination to be U.S. District Judge for the Central District of California pursuant to Section 3, subsection 1A of the Senate Resolution 27 of the 117th Congress. I will transmit the notice of the tie vote to the Secretary of the Senate. Under Section 3, subsection 1B of that resolution, either the majority or minority leader may then make a motion to discharge the nomination. Next is Georgette Kastner, nominated to the District of New Jersey. Anyone seek recognition? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Coons. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Asa. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Corning. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Sass. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mrs. Blackburn.
No by proxy.
Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 12, the nays are 10.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. Next is Judge Ruth Montenegro for the Southern District of California. Anyone seek recognition? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Coons. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Grassley.
Aye.
Mr. Graham.
Mr. Graham? Oh. Aye by proxy.
Mr. Corning. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Sass. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
Aye.
Mrs. Blackburn.
No by proxy.
Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 14, the nays are 8.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. Next, we'll vote on Judge Julie Rubin, nominated to the District of Maryland. Anyone seek recognition? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye.
Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Coons. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Corning.
No by proxy.
Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Sacks. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
Aye.
Mrs. Blackburn.
Should be no by proxy. Blackburn.
Oh, no by proxy.
Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 13, the nays are 9.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. We next have Judge Christina Silva, nominated to the District of Nevada. Is there anyone seeking recognition? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Coons. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirona. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Asa. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Sacks. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mrs. Blackburn.
No by proxy.
Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 12, the nays are 10.
The nomination will be favorably reported to the floor. Finally, we have Ann Traum, nominated to the District of Nevada. Anyone seek recognition? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Coons. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirona. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Asa. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Sacks. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
No.
Mr. Tillis.
No.
Mrs. Blackburn.
No by proxy.
Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 12, the nays are 10.
Nomination will be favorably reported to the floor.
Mr. Chairman, I have a request from Senator Graham to put in a list of oversight hearings he had when he was chairman of this committee the last 2 years.
Without objection. And now we turn to the bill on today's agenda, S-2992, the American Innovation and Choice Online Act. I want to thank Subcommittee Chair Klobuchar and Ranking Member Grassley for their leadership on this bill, of which I'm a co-sponsor. The bill sponsors have filed a manager's amendment. I'll speak briefly to the bill and then turn to the lead sponsors, Klobuchar and Grassley, to offer the manager's amendment. This legislation addresses the efforts by online platforms to use their market dominance to preference their own products over those of other businesses that use the platform, or to discriminate against other businesses in the enforcement of the platform's terms of service in a way that would materially harm competition. I won't go through all detail here, but I will say that the members of the subcommittee have had hearings and have compiled testimony from a lot of sources, public and private, before this bill reached the floor. I won't read all the details other than to say that I believe that this bill is a step in the right direction. I am particularly encouraged by a group that I respect, the Consumer Reports, which sent a letter this week saying that they applauded the bipartisan group of senators working together to address problematic market power of the largest online platforms. And let me at this point turn the floor over to the lead sponsor of the amendment, Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Chairman Durbin, for listing the American Innovation and Choice Online Act on the committee's agenda. Our ranking member Grassley has already given strong comments and has shown such strong leadership as the lead Republican on this bill, which we introduced along with Senators Durbin, Graham, Blumenthal, Kennedy, Booker, Hawley, Hirono on this committee, as well as Senators Warner, Daines, and Lummis. I think one commentator referred to it as the Ocean's 11 of co-sponsors, with people having one thing in common, which I know is shared by many members of this committee, no matter where they come from, and that is that we've got to have fair competition in this country. What this is about is, at its core, monopolies, dominant platforms, American companies that have given us incredible innovations, employ many people that we are proud of. But at some point, when you have a situation where, for example, Google controls more than 90%, my colleagues, of the online search market, and Apple and Google operating as twin monopolies in app distribution through their app stores, using their market power to charge up to a 30% tax, something that Senator Blackburn and Blumenthal and I have been working on competing app developers that have to use the App Store to reach their users. We have to look at this differently than just startup companies in a garage. That's not what they are anymore. They may have started small, but now they are dominant platforms. These are some of the most successful companies in the world.
I've spoken.
As I mentioned, we are proud of their success.
speak if I
We
got
all know here that they have a bunch of money, and that's fine. That's capitalism. But in America, we never rest on success. And one of the ways we do this is by figuring out what is working, what isn't working, how we fix it, so we rejuvenate our capitalist markets. To quote Adam Smith, the so-called godfather of capitalism, the invisible hand of competitive entrepreneurship is the key to a strong capitalist economy. I think a lot of people would agree with this in this room. But he added, and this isn't as well known, only if we have a government that effectively takes on what he called the overgrown standing army of monopolists. What laws, we'll start with this, has the Senate passed to curb monopoly power in this area? Not one. We haven't meaningfully updated our antitrust laws since the birth of the internet. In fact, despite broad bipartisan support, standing with Americans on issues like privacy and rules of the road for tech, we haven't passed anything. Part of this, we know, is the power out there. And I truly appreciate those senators that are co-sponsors, those that have kept an open mind, those that have had questions about this, because you're doing your jobs. Because what we're dealing with right now is that in 2021, Amazon and Facebook were both in the top 3 of federal lobbying expenditures in the nation. In 2020, they each spent more than any other company in America. They're running ads, they're doing everything. That actually is somewhat predictable. But what has been really heartening for me is that maybe what wasn't predictable to them is that their senators in this body are willing to say, you know what, we want these companies to be successful, like Senator Grassley, I know, believes, but at some point we have to have some rules of the road to make things fair. Going back to last Congress, we have held hearings, as Senator Grassley explained, in the Competition Policy Subcommittee, which I'm proud to chair with Senator Lee, on anti-competitive conduct by digital monopolies. And the testimony has been troubling. Time and time again, we heard about how these companies abuse their power as monopolies. And who is paying the price? Everyone else, from small businesses to sometimes mid-size and big businesses to consumers. Here are a few examples. In a November full Judiciary Committee chaired by Senator Durbin, the founder of a small business that sells on Amazon told us that Amazon knocked off his product after he spent years refining his ideas and securing patents. Another example, the Wall Street Journal reported that an Amazon employee working on new products accessed data on a car trunk organizer manufactured by a third-party seller called Fortum, a four-person Brooklyn-based company run by two 29-year-olds. Soon after, Amazon launched 3 trunk organizers similar to Fortum's under its Amazon Basics private label brand. There is no way that people on this committee can think that's okay. Last April in the subcommittee, we heard from Tile, a bigger company, about how they had a good relationship with Apple until Apple decided to create a competing product and then refused to give Tile access to a chip that would allow it to compete with Apple's product on equal terms. Tile told this committee that they believe only legislation would get Apple to stop this anti-competitive behavior. In June, we heard from Sonos, an innovative home speaker company, about how dominant players like Google and Amazon, all of which have competing devices, make interoperating with their platforms, quote, difficult if not impossible. Sonos told us that we're currently on the path towards a few dominant companies controlling all of the home device ecosystem. In our December subcommittee hearing on innovation, at which we discussed this bill in particular, we heard from the founder of messaging startup Beeper about how big tech companies like Facebook have boxed out competitors' messaging services and preferenced their own products. I know that almost everyone in this room have heard from the gatekeeper platform companies. They don't like our bill. You can see the ads on TV. But for the first time, the monopoly power is going to be challenged in what I consider to be a smart way. They are going to suggest amendment after amendment, by the way, my friends, change after change, and they're never going to like this bill. As you all know from the testimony of the Facebook whistleblower over in the Commerce Committee, which Senator Blumenthal and Blackburn did such an excellent job working on together, from Spotify, who came before this committee, and Match.com, when people take them on or companies take them on, they have for decades formed an impenetrable shield. They're making a lot of money. They want to maintain and profit and keep their positions as monopoly gatekeepers. Despite the flood of misinformation and outright lies about this bill from these companies, I appreciate my co-sponsor, Senator Grassley's irascible ability to continue to support this common sense support and take on this misinformation. And in fact, the results are clear. Let me read you the headline from a Washington Post editorial about this legislation. After we made changes to the House version of the bill, they said this in the headline: finally, a promising piece of tech antitrust legislation in Congress. The Boston Globe published an op-ed titled, "A Chance for Congress to Turn Concern Over Big Tech Sway into Action." This is about creating rules of the road. It's about not letting these monopolies unfairly put their products first over the products of competitors just because of their market dominance. It's about not letting them use private third-party information that they only have because of their monopoly power to copy smaller competitors' products. This isn't fair. It isn't reasonable. And let's be clear, these are not new concerns. We have been hearing about this anti-competitive self-preferencing by dominant digital platforms for more than a decade. There are hearings long before I ever chaired this subcommittee. The European Commission started an investigation into Google's favoring its own shopping product in its search results more than 10 years ago. In 2012, the Federal Trade Commission also investigated Google for favoring its own products in search. And we know that during the Trump administration, cases were brought against these platforms in both the Justice Department and the FTC, and those cases have been continued by the Biden administration, Justice Department, and FTC. As I've mentioned, we've heard that Amazon unfairly favors its own products, and then it uses vendors' non-public data to develop products to compete against them. We've heard about Facebook crippling the functionality of competing products like Vine, which ultimately puts them out of business. We know that Google puts its own restaurant reviews and travel services first in search results, driving businesses to itself through its market power in search. All of this and more was painstakingly documented in a lengthy report issued following a 16-month bipartisan investigation in the House Judiciary Committee on the state of competition in digital markets. I know that people on our side of the aisle have talked to Representative Cicilline about this, and people on the other side of the aisle have talked to Representative Buck. They worked together on this from beginning to end. That investigation was a serious and comprehensive one, including multiple hearings, numerous witness interviews, and an extensive review of millions of documents. These are all practices that distort competition, limit the ability of small businesses to compete, stifle innovation, and most importantly, harm consumers. Before introducing this bill in the Senate, I worked with Senator Grassley to make a number of changes to the House version to ensure that not only will the bill protect consumers and give small and medium-sized businesses a shot at competing, but that the platforms covered under the bill can still continue to innovate and compete. Senator Grassley and I have also been soliciting and receiving feedback on the legislation over the last several months from businesses, consumer groups, the platforms themselves, and from many of you. And we have used that feedback to create the manager's amendment that we're offering today. That manager's amendment makes further updates to the bill that will provide privacy and security, including provisions to clarify, and this is key with some of the concerns many of you have raised, to clarify that certain types of privacy-enhancing conduct would, of course, be allowed and permitted. The manager's amendment also included changes to ensure that powerful platforms won't escape the bill's coverage merely because they are not publicly traded, to make clear that subscription services like Amazon Prime are not impacted by the bill. This was a claim that Senator Grassley and I think, soundly defeated in the original bill, but just to make it clear for people, we included this provision. To mandate that the federal enforcers issue robust agency enforcement guidelines within 9 months of enactment to provide clarity to the business community, a request from several members. To provide a 1-year period for covered platforms to come into compliance, again, a request from several members and the platforms. To clarify that covered platforms may still use the subscription models, which I mentioned, and other common sense revisions. The bill strikes the right balance between preventing the conduct that hurts competition while also ensuring that platforms can continue to provide privacy and data security features to their users, compete against rivals in the United States and abroad, and maintain services that benefit consumers. We have a lot of support for this bill. We don't have the money to run TV ads in favor of it like those that oppose it, but we have a lot of support. Most of the small business and consumer groups, again, don't have the funds to do that or hire big lobbyists, but nevertheless, they are strongly with us. We all have an interest in promoting a strong, competitive, innovative digital economy in this country. This bill is a balanced, bipartisan proposal to help achieve this goal. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this legislation as revised under the manager's amendment and voted out of this committee. January 1st, 1983 is considered the official birthday of the Internet. Now, nearly 40 years later, we are still here without a single piece of meaningful competition legislation addressing the massive economy that it has created. And if the tech companies and their armies of lobbyists, 2,500 at last count, are hoping that they can stop us from getting a vote, bring it on. This is our moment. Thank you.
Senator Klobuchar, Senator Grassley indicates to me that he stands by his opening statement, and traditionally we begin by adopting a manager's amendment and then see if there are any other amendments to be offered. Do you want to offer the manager's amendment?
I do. Thank you very much, Chairman. I would like to offer my amendment and Senator Grassley's amendment, SIL 22100.
All those in favor of the manager's amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The manager's amendment is adopted. I have 2 requests for recognition. The first is Senator Whitehouse.
Yeah, very briefly, Mr. Chairman. When enormous corporations clash in competition, sometimes it can cause pressure that is then brought to bear against workers, against employees. The defense of those employees when giants clash merits our attention and has received it in this manager's amendment. So I ask unanimous consent to be added as a co-sponsor to the bill. And I'll close with a word of appreciation to my Rhode Island colleague, Representative Cicilline, who has put enormous effort into the House version of this bill over on the House of Representatives as chair of the Judiciary Antitrust Committee, essentially the House parallel to Senator Klobuchar.
Without objection. Now, I have requests for recognition, 2 Democrats and 3 Republicans. Anyone, Senator
I
Leahy?
request,
You're on there.
Thank you.
Senator Leahy? Before Republicans, Cornyn, Lee. It starts with Senator Lee, Hawley, Tillis, Cornyn so far. Cruz. Okay, Senator Leahy?
Mr. Chairman, I voted for the substitute, and I've explained to Senator Klobuchar and Senator Grassley how we vote to report S-2992 to the floor. But I want to make clear that there are some important issues and ramifications I'd like to see addressed before I'd be comfortable supporting the bill on the floor. I commend, and I mean this strongly, both Senators Klobuchar and Grassley for the work to bring this comprehensive antitrust legislation before the committee. I don't think there's many that would disagree we need to review and update our antitrust laws for the rapidly growing digital economy. I appreciate changes made in the manager's amendment, including additional protections for intellectual property and for platforms utilizing end-to-end encryption. But I still have some concerns. First and foremost, I think the bill makes it too difficult for online platforms to adequately protect consumers' privacy. The bill creates a bar that's far too high for platforms to protect privacy without worrying about being penalized, which I worry could lead to a race to the bottom on Americans' privacy, and I suspect that will be discussed on the floor. I have other issues I'd like to work on with the sponsors of the bill, such as unintended economic consequences for small businesses who rely greatly on online platforms. I'm thinking of many such businesses in Vermont. I also want to make sure we're not inadvertently harming our national security. I know the sponsors will work with me, and I will work with them with an open mind on this as we go forward.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. It's my intention now to recognize the ranking member of the Antitrust Subcommittee, Senator Lee, followed by Senator Feinstein, and then Senator Hawley, Tillis, Cornyn, and Cruz. We'll try to go back and forth. And Senator Cotton. Senator Lee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to commend my colleagues, Senators Klobuchar and Grassley, for their work on this issue. Self-preferencing and other potentially anti-competitive behavior within the big tech industry has been a concern of mine for many years. In fact, it's been a concern that I've focused on ever since I first arrived in the Senate and was assigned at the Judiciary Committee back in 2011, when I was one of the first Republicans to openly challenge Google's behavior in the marketplace. It was likewise a big concern of mine when I chaired the Antitrust Subcommittee hearing on self-preferencing in the last Congress, and it very much remains a concern of mine today. All of this is to say that I share many of the goals of the authors and the co-sponsors of the bill. And I was a little surprised a moment ago to hear from the sponsor that those who have filed amendments, as I have, are seeking only to thwart the bill and have no desire, no intent, no willingness to work with the authors in order to make it better, to improve it to the point where we could vote for it. That does not describe my position at all. I do think there are issues, and I think if we can address those issues in ways that are sustainable, that would address the problem meaningfully, I'd love to get to yes, and I've been trying to figure out ways that I can do that. But I'm not there yet. We're not there yet. This bill isn't there yet. And I respectfully don't believe that we should be passing this bill out of committee. Let me explain what I mean. I've got some serious concerns with the legislation as it's now written. As well-intentioned as it might be, it's still got some issues. Specifically, I worry a lot about the broad scope and the vague language that it contains that I believe would lead to an untold number of unintended and unforeseen consequences, like harming many of the very same consumers that we're trying to protect. I also worry that quite perversely, and however unintentionally, it may actually entrench the very four companies at which it's aimed by creating a strong incentive to simply cease doing any business with third parties. This could crush thousands of small businesses, and it could actually worsen the state of competition in online markets. And I know that is not the intent of the bill, but we've got to be very careful when we do this to make sure that we're not creating more of the same problems that we're trying to address. That's why we hold hearings. That's why we hold markups. That's why we propose amendments. That's why we really have to understand legislation and all of its implications before we pass it out of this committee. It's our job. And this committee has historically, certainly throughout the duration of the 12 years I've been here, it's always aspired to be very thorough. Of all the committees on which I serve, and I like all my committee assignments, but I especially love this one. One of the reasons for that is that across the aisle, across the political spectrum, there's a strong desire among members of this committee, Democrats and Republicans alike, to make sure that we're thorough. And it's important, because a lot of what we do really has very far-reaching implications. This bill is no exception to that. And we owe those we serve that duty of being thorough. So, look, I'm committed to stopping big tech's manifestly anti-competitive, unjust, and abusive behavior. And it is all of those things, all of them. But I can't do it in good conscience in a way that risks such collateral damage as this bill presents. I can't. I'm also really concerned about the lack of scrutiny that this bill has received. And these two things are connected. You see, when it gets more scrutiny, when it has more coverage by us, we can know with a greater degree of certainty whether, to what extent, in what ways, this will cause unintended but very harmful consequences. Now, just to be clear on something, because it's been suggested that this has gotten the coverage that it needs. That's just not true. I wish it were, but it's not. And frankly, it shows. It shows in the end product. To date, we have had no legislative hearing on this bill. Not one. This, notwithstanding the fact that it's got a novel approach, it's got ambitious goals, it's innovative, which are all things that are great, but suggest all the more reason for us to have a degree of scrutiny over it with actual hearings. And no public answers have been provided in response to the various questions, serious questions, I would add, that have been posed by a number of our colleagues and by concerned citizens and by experts in the field of competition law. While the Antitrust Subcommittee held 8 hearings last year, and they were great hearings, not a single one of those 8 hearings, not one, was focused on this legislation. If we had had one, we have a great spirit of comedy and collegiality on that one, I would have gladly agreed to it, would have welcomed it. Still would. We still need one. We didn't have any. Now, although the bill was mentioned on occasion, mentioning a bill at a hearing is not the same as having a hearing in which you thoroughly analyze the implications of legislation. Now, the discussion in those hearings where it was mentioned was confined essentially to perfunctory statements of approval by a handful of hand-picked majority witnesses. So, I mean, that's fine. Everyone's allowed to do that in a hearing, to have people say nice things about a bill that we've introduced. I don't have any objection to that. But what I do object to is the suggestion that we have somehow held a hearing on this because the bill has been referenced favorably by hand-picked witnesses, albeit witnesses who have not in any way presented the bill as if in a legislative hearing. Sadly, this isn't surprising, as there's much about this bill that we still don't know. It may stop some anti-competitive behavior, but at what cost? How much pro-competitive behavior might get caught into the net too? How much pro-competitive behavior could we save and preserve while still pursuing effectively the anti-competitive behavior that we're talking about if we took a little bit more time and made sure that the provisions were ironed out more cleanly in a more well-thought-through fashion? Will the bill result, as drafted, in the removal of popular products and services that have benefited consumers? How will the interoperability requirements impact cybersecurity and privacy? Will judges interpret the bill to protect consumers or individual competitors? This is an important question, given that U.S. antitrust law, our competition policies in this country, have always focused, to our great benefit, on protecting competition itself, protecting competition with an eye toward protecting the consumer. The minute we start focusing on competitors rather than competition and consumers, the minute we could really end up with a very different product. And I just think we have to be careful about doing that. Doesn't mean that there's never an opportunity to revisit the way we're doing things, but we do have to be cautious. And this does represent a pretty major shift. Which companies will be covered by the bill in the future? And why aren't they covered now? Why are U.S. companies put at a disadvantage relative to foreign competitors? Will the bill help, or will it worsen the type of censorship that we've come to associate, some of us perhaps more than others, with big tech? It's maybe a little bit harder to grasp this concept unless you've experienced it firsthand. That there is censorship there, censorship of the sort that itself reflects an absence of adequate competition in this industry, and it does need to be addressed. Will 2-day shipping turn into 7 to 12-day shipping? Questions about specific examples have been met more or less with the reply, look, we trust the government to bring good cases under this law. This response doesn't satisfy me. In fact, it should terrify any member of the United States Senate. What's more, the penalties imposed by the legislation are disconnected from the harm that they seek to discourage, rising to as much as 15% of a company's total revenue. And keep in mind, that money isn't even going to consumers, not even going to the victims of the behavior in question. Instead, it'll just line government coffers. In any law, penalties really should be tied to harm. Abandoning this approach, as this bill does, may actually result in fewer attempts to offer consumers new and better products and services at better prices. I don't see how this helps innovation or choice online to take the approach that I've just described. Now, on top of all these practical concerns, I do have some philosophical concerns with granting executive branch agencies sweeping new power and expansive discretion to reshape markets, to redefine them. This has never once worked out in the past. Never, ever. And I see no reason why it would work now. And so, to my fellow Republicans on the committee, I'd ask, what do we gain? What do we gain here by giving deep state bureaucrats control over big tech? What do we gain when we do that? And why not insist that in addition to anything else we might do to promote competition in this area, why don't we also insist that whatever else we do in this area is accompanied by some genuine effort to address the censorship problem, which we uniquely have felt and are feeling every single day. The Republicans on the committee know exactly what I'm talking about. This is exactly what they've wanted all along, not to break up big tech to protect us, but to control it and to use it against us. We can't hand the keys to big tech over to radical ideologues, more concerned with power and control than they are with prosperity and economic freedom. And yes, I'm talking about the FTC. At the same time, it's not enough for Republicans to simply be the party of no. We need to offer our own solutions. It's one of the many reasons why I've introduced a number of amendments to this bill. I've offered those and other suggestions to the bill's sponsors previously, and I'm offering a number of them today. And no, this is not an effort by me to say we don't need to do anything. It's not an effort by me to simply kill this bill because I disagree with the need to address things in this area. No, I'm just doing my job. I'm doing it thoroughly because I believe strongly in the adage that we've got to first do no harm. And in order to ascertain whether we're doing harm, we've got to understand the legislation. This thing has not received the airing that it needs. Look, with all that in mind, in addition to my ongoing legislative efforts, including with some bills that I've filed over the last few months and years to address big tech censorship, conflicts of interest in digital advertising, and overall antitrust reform, I intend to offer a number of amendments to this bill to help us achieve our common goal. I look forward to their consideration by this committee. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, could I
Mr. Chairman.
respond? I'm sorry. Could I respond?
Well,
I'll let Senator Klobuchar respond and then recognize Senator Feinstein.
Thank you. I'm going to make this brief because I know there's other senators that want to speak. But Senator Lee, you and I have had a long-time friendship, and I want to correct some things for the record because I'm actually kind of shocked by some of the things you said. First of all, you just said that it was a perfunctory hearing only with majority witnesses that perfunctorily said they supported the bill. I'd like to put on the record, Mr. Chair, a letter from your own witness, Senator Lee, from that hearing in December, who said he supported the bill. That would be the professor from the University of Notre Dame, Roger Alford. So what you said was incorrect. It wasn't just majority witnesses from that hearing that supported that bill. Your own witness supported the bill. All right?
Thank you.
Secondly, the bill was first introduced in the House, a version of it, last June, following a 16-month investigation by the House Judiciary Committee's Antitrust Subcommittee into the state of competition online. You'd have to have your head in the sand if you didn't know that was going on. And if you haven't read those reports that Representative Buck, a friend of yours, worked on for a long, long time, then I suggest that you do. They're very disturbing. That investigation included 7 congressional hearings, the production of nearly 1.3 million internal documents, and communications submissions from 38 antitrust experts and more than 240 interviews. Here in the Senate, the bill and the topics that we have been discussing have been thoroughly explored, as Senator Grassley has explained. We've had 4 separate hearings related to this topic of discrimination. In my opening statement, I actually went through a number of pieces of testimony from witnesses, small businesses, big businesses, individuals that supported this bill and the reason we introduced this bill. There was one in 2021, just in 2021, 4 ones. One on app stores on April 21st, one on connected home tech on June 15th, one on big data on September 21st, and one on innovation on December 15th. That's a hearing where your own witness said he supported this bill because this bill was the subject of the discussion of this hearing at length. In April, we held a hearing about the monopolies in the App Store market. As I said at the hearing, just because a company creates a successful, innovative business that consumers like doesn't give it a free pass to harm competition or ignore our antitrust laws. In June, I told witnesses from Amazon and Google that as those companies expand their connected home device offerings and it gets a bigger and bigger market, I have concerns about your incentives to preference your own connected devices over competing products. This was discussed by several senators. And I asked them, given some of the other self-preferencing we've seen in other aspects of the tech business, why shouldn't we be concerned? And the witness from Sonos, who I've already quoted, a smaller connected speaker company, also talked about this concern. In September, we held a hearing on the control that the big tech platforms have on user data. Charlotte Slayman from Public Knowledge testified about self-preferencing behavior by digital gatekeepers. I could go on and on about every hearing, and Mr. Chairman, I will put a document in the record. We introduced the bill last October. That is months and months ago. Since that time, as I said, my staff and I have worked closely with Senator Grassley and his staff, and together they have spoken to at least 40 different stakeholders about the text of the bill. We have also heard from 21 state attorney generals, 21 state attorney generals, including from California, North Carolina, Tennessee, Nebraska, Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, Hawaii, Iowa, Louisiana, Rhode Island, Utah, and Minnesota, applauding our efforts to update the bill, our law, to take up the bill, including the ones we are considering today. I've had dozens of conversations with my fellow members of this committee about the bill, and our staff has had dozens more. And since we are talking about numbers, let's put out a few others. Apple is worth $2.7 trillion. Alphabet, Google's parent company, is worth $1.8 trillion. Amazon is worth $1.6 trillion. And Facebook, now known as Meta, is worth $885 billion. Microsoft is worth $2.2 trillion. These are five of the 10 most valuable companies in the world. Yes, we're proud of it. But at some point, when we are dealing with companies of that size, I don't think it is a surprise that it is not easy to finally put some rules of the road. And if you want to know why we have done absolutely nothing in this building for 20 years on this topic, I think that pretty much answers it. So I have worked very carefully with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to make sure that this bill is sensible and it does something. But if we want to be serious about making sure that we're not just relying on the past in how we deal with monopolies based on laws from 100 years ago, then we are going to have to do something about this. And I think this is a good beginning, and it doesn't get at a lot of the concerns that have been raised about other bills, and that's why we're starting with this legislation. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Put a statement in the record on the same points that she made about the process.
Senator Grassley, without objection, will be allowed to enter a statement in the record.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to respond.
If you just withhold for just 1 minute, if we're going to get to the point where we're going to actually offer amendments, I hope we do, we ought to be thinking about the debate leading to an amendment which may address the subject of this continuing debate. That's all I have to add. I've asked Senator Feinstein to stand back 2 or 3 times, and then I'll go to Senator Lee again.
Oh, thank you very much. Members, I'm very concerned about the bill this committee is considering. It's not really the type of legislation that we usually consider, where the rules are laid out and everyone is expected to comply. Instead, it's specifically designed to target a small number of specific companies, most of which are headquartered in my home state of California. If the conduct this bill seeks to prevent is unfair and improper, I believe that conduct should be prevented from anyone who engages in it, not only a small handful of companies. Instead of updating antitrust law for our modern online economy, as it aims to do, this bill will create 2 separate legal standards. one that poses very significant barriers to the business operations of a few large tech companies and one for everyone else. I'm told that companies involved are Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft, companies in California and Washington, and one for everyone else. It's difficult to see the justification for a bill that regulates the behavior of only a handful of companies while allowing everyone else to continue engaging in that exact same behavior. Let me give you an example. Let's say someone goes online to buy stationery. They could go to Target or Walmart's website and search for stationery. And those websites could show them Target branded or Walmart branded stationery first and make them scroll through several pages of options before they show them stationery from other sellers. But under this legislation, if they instead went into Amazon's website to buy the stationery, Amazon could not do exactly the same thing. Amazon could not show them Amazon branded stationery before it shows them stationery from other sellers. This dramatically different result for engaging in the exact same behavior doesn't make sense. I'm concerned that legislating in such a targeted manner may create the opposite of the intended effect. I've tried to find out, well, who is actually benefited by this? Who is actually targeted? And what I've learned is Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, and maybe Microsoft and TikTok, but we don't know. I'm concerned that this is really going to be very dangerous legislation. It may end up giving a competitive advantage to others large global businesses that narrowly escape being regulated by the bill. I recognize that our nation's original antitrust laws were inspired by practices of specific sets of companies, but those laws targeted all anti-competitive behavior across the market, not just the practices of a small set of companies that inspired the laws. As we consider improving antitrust laws for the online economy, I believe we should continue to legislate in a way that applies fairly to everyone who engages in the behavior we're concerned with, and not just a few. I also want to note, and I believe we will discuss this further, that the bill causes some very significant security concerns. Today, major platforms like Apple and Google take measures to address the privacy and cybersecurity of their users. That may not be perfect. We may want them to do better or work more closely with law enforcement. But this bill would actually prevent companies like Apple from taking steps to ensure that an application is safe before you download it from your phone. This makes no sense. We're requiring companies to take down protections that are in place today and instead allow hackers and those looking to steal personal data to access the devices. I'm told that federal agencies have concerns about these provisions, but this committee has not had the benefit of their input. For these reasons, I will oppose this bill today. I strongly believe it would have been helpful for this bill to receive the benefit of a full committee hearing before we voted on it in order to discuss these concerns, and I hope that might still be the case. I look forward to working with my colleagues on the committee to address these issues as the bill makes its way to the floor.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask the senator a question? Are you implying, Senator Feinstein, that the U.S. government, that the administration is against this bill? You just said that federal agencies had concerns, and I would like to know if you have some knowledge that I do not know that the administration is against it, since they have made antitrust enforcement, as has the Justice Department, a major priority.
No, I do not know. What I said is, I am told that federal agencies have concerns about these provisions.
Okay,
But
well,
this
that is a
committee
pretty
has
bold
not
statement.
had the benefit of their input.
That is a bold statement.
So,
Well, I'm sorry, Senator, it's what I think, and I thought we're able to say what I have been told that.
By who?
And you may not like it.
Well, no, I don't like it at all, because I think that it's not true.
I'm going to ask that we return to some order here, and it's up to the committee how we want to deal with this. Making general statements about the concept in the bill is certainly appropriate and consistent with our committee history. We have over 100 amendments that have been filed. And if members have amendments that they wish to offer at any point, I think the floor should be open for that purpose.
Well, Mr. Chairman, may I finish?
I thought you were, I'm
No,
sorry,
no.
I thought you
Let
were
me
finished.
just, I want to end by saying it would have been helpful for the bill to receive the benefit of a full committee hearing before we voted on it and have the ability to address these concerns.
Thank you, Senator Feinstein. Now, let me tell you who I have on the list, and then you can decide if I call on you whether you wish to speak to the bill, address part of this debate, or offer an amendment. But I think if we are going to reach any constructive conclusion, that we should be talking about amendments and voting on them. But let me tell you who's on the list. Senator Hawley is going to be next, then Senator Blumenthal, then Senator Tillis, then Senator Coons, Senator Cornyn, Senator Padilla, Senator Cruz, and then I have Senators Cotton and Blackburn on the list. Senator Lee?
Senator Klobuchar, you're exactly right. Professor Roger Alford of Notre Dame did say nice things about your bill, and I neglected that point. I should have pointed it out. I should have used the word mostly when referring to majority witnesses. You're absolutely right. In that same hearing, he also said nice things about my bill, the TEAM Act. The two operate in different universes. They're not compatible with each other. But really, more to the point, it's still not the same as having a hearing. In not one of these hearings in which this has received a mention was it much more than a mention. In not one of these hearings did we have witnesses brought in for the purpose of answering questions regarding how these provisions, individually and collectively, would operate. And not one of these hearings was that the purpose of the hearing. Now, it's true, as Senator Klobuchar points out, that the House did hold some hearings. To my knowledge, that was before this legislation in the Senate was filed. Now, this legislation in the Senate was filed on October 18th. As I recall, we've had, I think, two at the most, perhaps one antitrust subcommittee hearing since it was filed in the Senate on October 18th. In preparation for our December hearing, when we first asked about what the topic of it would be, we asked whether it would be about your bill, about this bill that we're talking about today, that we're marking up today. And we were told, no. And it wasn't. So we still have yet to hold a hearing on this bill. Even if the House had held hearings specifically on this bill, which after this bill was filed, which I don't think has happened, even if that had happened, it's not the same as a Senate hearing. That doesn't discharge us of any duties we have here to hold our hearings. We still have not held any hearings on this. And it's hearings that allow us to get answers to questions about how these various provisions would operate, whether, to what extent they could enhance competition and how they might harm competition, and how we could change it to fix those problems. Thank you.
Obviously, I disagree, Mr. Chairman, but I'm not going to go on. I cannot tell you how many times we've discussed this issue of self-preferencing at hearings.
All right, the next up on my list is Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm proud to co-sponsor this bill and to support it. I want to thank Senator Klobuchar for her work on this and Senator Grassley and others. Senator Feinstein said a minute ago, she pointed out, I think rightly, that this bill is very specific and does target specific behavior, anti-competitive behavior in a specific set of markets. I think that that's a virtue and not a vice. I think that the targeted, focused nature of this bill is something that ought to recommend it to this committee. Because what it does is that it goes after classic monopolist behavior when you have giant monopoly platforms who are using their monopoly power to self-preference their own products and services and affiliated sites against and to the detriment of independent third-party competitors and providers. In other words, it goes right at anti-competitive conduct. I think that's important. Senator Klobuchar talked about the need for fair competition. To be honest with you, I'd be happy with any competition. What we need is more competition in these markets, not less. And I think that the record is now pretty well established that these monopoly-sized platforms are using their power to throttle down competition across the board, whether they're buying competitors or in the conduct that this bill looks at and targets, using their market dominance to preference their own products or affiliated services. And again, I think the fact that this bill targets that is much to its credit. I do want to respectfully disagree with Senator Lee's characterization that this bill would somehow strengthen big tech. I just think that that's not accurate. This bill specifically goes at a pillar of the big tech business model, which is built on self-preferencing and the use of monopoly power and monopoly prerogatives, the monopoly privileges that these companies have amassed. And, you know, I agree with Senator Lee's deep concern about what I think of as the big tech, big government alliance. It's a huge problem. It's one of the reasons that big tech has gotten to be so big and powerful. But this bill, I think, strikes at that alliance by ending the self-preferencing that is a core part of these companies' business model. I also agree with Senator Lee's concerns about speech. And I would submit that one of the problems, one of the reasons we see abuses of speech, we see discriminatory conduct towards speech, and the abuse of the principle of free speech by these companies is they're so darn big and powerful that they can do whatever it is they want. They're a law unto themselves. And I think that we need to take action that will protect free speech, but this bill that gets at competition is important. Here's the last thing I'd say, Mr. Chairman, is just as a conservative, as somebody who believes in the free market, the core of the free market is free and open competition. The ability to enter the market, to compete, to have your chance to succeed. And when we, historically in this country, when defenders of the marketplace have seen companies get so big and powerful that they use their prerogatives to shut down competition, we've acted to say, no, that actually hurts the market, and we've acted to open the market back up. I think this bill is much in that tradition, and I would just say to my Republican Party colleagues that the tradition of antitrust in this country is a Republican tradition. Sherman Antitrust Act, that's Senator John Sherman from Ohio, Republican. The McKinley administration, the Roosevelt administration, the Taft administration, all Republicans. It became a bipartisan tradition, which we're proud of and continue that today. But I think there's much to be said for us as Republicans, as the party of the free market of competition, to taking steps towards seeing that that is true today. That is not in any way to dismiss the concerns of Senator Lee or to say that they're invalid. I don't think they are at all. And I think Senator Lee raises valid concerns. I hope that we can work together to get those addressed. But I do think that this bill is an important step forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. It's my understanding the Senate is now on the floor in session, and we are likely to have a vote at noon. I'm certain that that's going to be kept open for some period of time. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by thanking Senator Klobuchar for her leadership and Senator Grassley, all of my colleagues who have joined in this historic bill. It is a historic bill. It's a big bill because it addresses abuses by big tech, which is a historic imperative. We need this bill to help consumers and competitors. We all use Google and Amazon to shop. Consumers have no idea that Google and Amazon are not giving them the cheapest or best products. They're giving them the products and preferring products that make the most money for them. Amazon will promote their own knockoff products. They're products that have serious safety defects. Amazon promotes companies that are paying them for other services. They're not getting the cheapest or safest products. Google is using its dominance over search to exclude and stifle competitors to its own shopping and map products. Consumers have no idea that they are, in effect, paying a tax, the app tax, that they are paying through the commission, in effect, that is charged on their products by Apple and Google to reach services. So there is a real impact on consumers, on competitors whose services are stifled, and what this bill does is provide fair access and competition. As to the process issues here, there has been extensive fact-finding, fair and comprehensive hearings on this bill. There is abundant evidence for the need to address these problems. Senator Klobuchar is right. It's going to be opposed by an army of lobbyists and lawyers. The big tech companies have no limits as to the resources they'll bring to bear in seeking to stifle this bill, but it is a big and historic bill that reflects very careful and deliberate crafting to target the harms and to prevent the stifling of innovation and throttling of choices by consumers. I hope that we can report it as quickly and expeditiously as possible and give all of our colleagues an opportunity to vote for it on the floor. Thank you.
The order of recognition is Tillis, Coons, Cornyn. Senator Tillis.
Mr. Chairman, I got good news and bad news. The bad news is I got a speech that's a little bit longer than I'm comfortable with giving. The good news is I'm not going to request any votes on the dozens of amendments that I have filed. So I think that's a fair trade-off. I want to thank Senator Klobuchar and Senator Grassley. I think that they've done great work on addressing competition policy, and I do believe that we need to update and modernize our law for the 21st century. I share the general goal and agree that we have competition policy problem across multiple sectors. I want to work with them on constructive and productive solutions to restore competition to the American economy. However, I have concerns with this specific bill as it's currently drafted. I believe the bill overreaches and it needs further refinement before it's considered by the full Senate. I've submitted over 40 amendments. These are offered in the spirit of furthering discussion in a bipartisan, constructive manner. The point's not to cause trouble or to undermine what Senator Klobuchar's good faith, thoughtful work, and her good faith and thoughtful work, but instead to highlight some of the real concerns I have with the bill. In that spirit, I'm going to withdraw the amendments, and I'm going to continue to work with the members and the staff, but I want to talk about a few of my specific concerns. First, the bill needs more clarity. As a business person, I have questions about who's covered by the law, what it permits, and what's going to happen in terms of enforcement. Under the bill, preferencing is now illegal. Do we even know what that means? Business users includes anyone who is likely to use a platform. Who is that? How is directing someone different than steering them? And why are they different? I've had many stakeholders, both big and small, and representing almost every single industry, reach out, but it isn't clear who may be implicated in the future. Excuse me. Our laws need to be clear. That's the only way businesses thrive. Second, it needs to clarify or clearly tie to competition policy. To my initial point, it's not clear how existing competitor or competition jurisprudence would support or be changed by the bill. The purpose of competition law is to eliminate harm to consumers, not to pick winners and losers. I'm also aware of the spirit of debate whether decades of antitrust law based on consumer welfare standards should be put in the burn pit. I'm open to having separate discussion about potential changes to that standard, and I hope that we will. But as it stands in relation to this bill, what standard will enforcers look to? One of my amendments would insert consumer welfare standard back into the definition of material harm to competition so that it clearly ties to competition. It also suggests language about pro-competitive justifications. Third, the bill gives too much discretion to the antitrust enforcement agencies, and in particular, the unelected bureaucrats at the FTC, to regulate critical aspects for our digital economy, cybersecurity, intellectual property, and national security. If we're concerned with large gatekeepers having too much unregulated power, then we need to ask ourselves, why are we creating one? Many of my proposed amendments address this, although I'm aware that some of my colleagues would go further. Fourth, there are potential downsides, many of which I think are unintentional. This bill is styled as an innovation and choice bill, yet it would disrupt the leading players in our digital economy at a time when we need all hands on deck. Big can be, and many times is, bad, but big is not always bad. Anti-competitive behavior is bad. Hyper-competitive behavior in this landscape is good, and we need to make sure that we distinguish the differences. We need to be focused on maintaining U.S. global technology leadership and supporting innovation. The bill, as it's currently drafted, risks stifling innovation, curbing investments that will simulate our nation's leading research and development community. These are just a few of my concerns with the bill. But I want to be clear that just because I'm offering amendments and voting no on the bill doesn't mean that I'm not concerned with competition, and I don't want to work, and I do want to work to get to a yes. I've heard from stakeholders about coercive contracts, problems with Google's dominance in search and advertising, Google and Apple manipulating App Store market, more recent reports of Google and Facebook fixing prices. Those are all issues that we should be looking at. Some of them can be best addressed through vigorous antitrust enforcement. We may also need to have a more refined and targeted legislation, some of the proposals that Senator Lee had put forth among them. But I want to continue working. And I want to thank Senator Klobuchar for her hard work on competition policy. She is truly a wonk. And if you've read her book, as many of my staff had, she's also a scholar on this issue, and you've got a few fans in my camp. And I also want to thank your staff, Senator Klobuchar. Susan and my other members of my staff say that Mark Avery and Keegan have been very professional, they're very thoughtful, and they very much are experts in the subject matter. So in that spirit, I'm not going to ask for a vote on any of my amendments. But I do hope that we can continue to work together to fine-tune this bill to garner greater support. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Senator Tillis.
As for Senator Klobuchar's book, we appreciate that as a gift, and we're looking forward to the movie. Senator Coons?
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, and to Senator Klobuchar, Senator Grassley, and the other co-sponsors of this bill. I want to start by commending Senator Klobuchar and my other colleagues on what has been a truly bipartisan effort to break ground in an issue where we have made precious little progress in this Congress over several sessions. This is an area where we have to make progress legislatively to reckon with the dominant tech platforms and their anti-competitive impacts and their so far unknown impacts on our society as well as our economy. I'll briefly mention a bill that I'm developing with Senator Klobuchar and Senator Portman that would require social media platforms to provide researchers and the public with access to data to help us better understand user behavior and how content moves on these platforms and its potentially pernicious impact on its users. So in navigating that, I've become even more familiar with my colleagues' deep commitment to addressing substantive and complex policy issues, and I'm excited to see meaningful bipartisan work in this area proceed. We all agree that the largest digital platforms exercise enormous market power and at times exercise them in monopolistic ways, and I share the concerns many have expressed about the impact that anti-competitive behavior can have on consumers and innovation. But given that all the platforms here at issue have distinct business models, and a number of the concepts introduced here are relatively new, I have significant concerns to balance about whether or not this bill achieves the right balance between the costs and inefficiencies of litigation and compliance and potentially unintended negative consequences on the competitiveness globally of our digital democracy principles on the world stage, and whether or not we're achieving enough progress in terms of combating any competitive behavior on the other. I've had very fruitful conversations with Senator Klobuchar about these concerns. She's been engaging and pragmatic as always, and I commend her for the work she's done to move this legislation forward. I was pleased to see that the manager's amendment recognized some of the concerns raised by myself and by other colleagues. I am not yet persuaded the legislation would most efficiently address any competitive behavior while improving the state of play for consumers and their privacy and data security. I have remaining concerns about privacy and security, about our global competitiveness, and about services that are widely popular with consumers and my constituents. So I am going to support this bill in markup here today in this committee, but I expect the bill sponsors will continue to work to address some of these open questions that I and many others have expressed about the bill, so that we might be able to further amend it and ultimately support it in its passage on the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The list in recognition, Cornyn, Padilla, Cruz. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by saying to Senator Klobuchar and Senator Grassley, thanks for tackling an important issue and for your Herculean effort. It's clear you've approached it, the important question of holding big tech accountable with serious and thoughtful efforts. I share many of the concerns that senators have raised, but I do want to raise some concerns about the process. And my experience around here is that process has a big impact on the quality of the product we're ultimately able to pass, assuming we can pass it at all. I'm struck by the bipartisan nature of the questions and concerns that have been raised here today. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that this bill has never had a full committee hearing. A number of us on a bipartisan basis have asked the chairman for a full committee hearing so that we can better understand what both the intended and unintended consequences of this legislation are. I would note that there are only 8 of the 21 members of this committee that are members of the Antitrust Committee, and while I respect the work that Senator Klobuchar and Senator Lee have done on that committee, I don't pretend to understand all of it, but I respect their diligence and their effort. But what that means is that the rest of the members of this committee have had no opportunity to ask questions of the witnesses and explore, as I said, the intended and unintended consequences of the bill. And I think that's a reflection of the process. I also believe that as a result of some of the hesitancy that we're hearing today, because there has not been an opportunity for the sort of searching inquiry by all members of the committee, I'm concerned that this bill will be damaged at this juncture and have less opportunity to actually make its way to the Senate floor and to become law. I think in our haste, sometimes I know we get frustrated by the process. We all do. But if you try to jam a bill through before members of the committee have had an opportunity to ask questions and to get those answers and explore the intended and unintended consequences, sometimes I have seen that fatally damage the chances of getting that bill actually passed into law. I do have concerns about the impact of this bill on American businesses' ability to compete in a global economy, and that it will also create potential harmful impacts on our national security. I think there are also questions about cyber security and data privacy that have not been answered. And I would just conclude by saying that the manager's amendment was circulated less than 2 days ago. And in my view, that itself commends further consideration. The changes are substantial, and the questions remaining about how they would resolve the potential issues have not been answered. So, Mr. Chairman, that is the statement I wish to make, and you said if people have amendments at the first appropriate opportunity, I have an amendment that I would offer. Thank you.
Please proceed with your amendment. I'm sorry, Senator Kennedy.
some of us wanted to make general comments.
Well, we can certainly use that approach. We can stick with the general comments and then have,
I'd like to make some general
is
comments.
that acceptable, Senator Cornyn?
I'd defer to any senator who wants to make some general comments before offering my
Then let's
amendment.
do
I just
that.
wanted to flag that for the chairman.
Is that all
Senator
right?
Durbin, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate comments. I hope we can get the comments to a normal amount of comments, because at some point we have to work on amendments. I appreciated Senator Tillis that's just holding his amendments for further work in the future, Senator Leahy's comments, but I would like to proceed. I'm going to stay here all day and night if I need to get this done.
Well, we have made some progress because 82 amendments have been withdrawn. But at this point, let's go through and let the members do their general comments, and let's turn to the amendment stage. And I would just say to the members, I'm staying till it's over, and I hope that you are too. So Senator Cornyn has spoken, Senator Padilla, Cruz, and Cotton.
And Kennedy.
You're on the list.
Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Similar to Senator Tillis, I'll articulate some questions and concerns, but refrain from flooding the committee with a dozen amendments or more, but rather articulate the questions and concerns that we can address. And let me start by saying I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, and the bill sponsors that there are significant issues, competition issues, facing the tech industry. And I agree with Senator Klobuchar that self-preferencing is one of them. Just like I agree with Senator Blumenthal that we need to enhance competition within the app ecosystem to ensure that consumers are empowered and benefit from quality, from innovation, and from choice. I represent California, home to the most populous and diverse state in the nation, population of 40 million. It's also home to the largest number of consumers compared to any other state in the nation, and consumers across the country rely on technology services to make our lives a little bit easier, to do our jobs, to connect with loved ones, and so much more. California is also home to many large, successful technology companies and even more startups and innovators and entrepreneurs. And please, colleagues, let's not forget the many, many workers who are employed directly or indirectly by the technology industry at all levels of the supply chain. So just as I've in the past considered tech bills as a member of the Los Angeles City Council, as a California state senator, now as United States Senator, this is my approach. I strive for policy that is inclusive and balanced of all these considerations, but let me make it clear. My first and foremost lens is how technology can help consumers. Now, having said that, I'm not yet convinced that this bill, as currently drafted, will actually provide the net benefit to consumers that we're seeking. I think we all agree that dominant tech firms that operate and compete on marketplaces can and do limit the ability of consumers to benefit from product innovation and choice. And one of the ways in which technology companies do this is by limiting the visibility and opportunity of smaller app developers and businesses. On the other hand, I respect that many consumers like the convenience of self-preferencing that enables them to type something into a search engine and receive answers to their queries right then and there without having to go through additional clicks or additional links. This is now a staple feature across search engines today. Now, this may be a simple example, but a lot of what has powered technological innovation over the last couple of decades has been the power and convenience of integrated services working together to the consumer's benefit. But given the broad language in this bill, here's a question. Is this committee choosing to trust regulators and courts to crack down on harmful self-preferencing practices while allowing activity that benefits consumers? I think we should approach this problem in a more measured manner to ensure we clearly identify and distinguish self-preferencing activity that hurts consumers from activity that actually helps consumers. I mean, the bill doesn't even define the term preferencing. For each covered platform, what constitutes that covered platform's operators' products, services, or lines of business? Or in the affirmative defenses section, what part of a covered platform constitutes core functionality? Important terms. Or even, how will the courts and litigants determine which services constitute a critical trading partner under this bill? If we want to crack down on anti-competitive behavior, and I do, and we agree exists, we need to be thoughtful about how we actually do that. And I'll just briefly echo some of the members that have raised the desire for a full committee hearing on this. I respect that there's been subcommittee hearings on the topics, I do, but I do think a full committee markup would best serve our consideration on this bill, and I'll recognize that this markup today is already a week earlier than was originally scheduled. Now, as several other committee members have already expressed, I share the concerns about the potential negative impact on consumer privacy and cybersecurity, so I won't go into details there. But more broadly, I do want to acknowledge that policymaking is often about incentives. While I'm excited by the prospect of ensuring consumers benefit from greater interoperability and consumer data portability, I'm equally concerned that consumer privacy and cybersecurity don't seem to be given equal consideration or priority in the bill as currently drafted. Colleagues, I know our constituents are banging down our doors, demanding a federal privacy law so we can put an end to abusive data collection and data laundering practices. They're demanding we do more to enhance the cybersecurity posture of industry. These values should be better reflected in the bill. Additionally, and this is particularly troubling, this bill may hamper the efforts of platforms to address the spread of hate speech and misinformation and disinformation efforts online that have caused so many recent problems for our democracy. For example, Section 3A3 on page 9 makes it illegal for covered platforms to discriminate in the application or enforcement of their terms of service among, quote, similarly situated business users, end quote. Now, this provision can be a gift to bad actors seeking to prevent platforms from blocking business users that peddle hate speech or, imagine, election disinformation. And here's how it would work. I'll explain it. Last year, in the wake of the January 6th insurrection, Parler was kicked out of Apple's App Store for violating its terms of service. If this bill had been law at the time, all a state attorney general would have to do is immediately threaten to file a lawsuit if, quote, other similarly situated business users, end quote, that were violating the terms of service were not also simultaneously kicked out of the App Store. Or worse, perhaps facing this new liability imposed by the language in this bill, Apple could have considered removing its terms of service mandating that apps have policies to deal with violence. And Parler could have stayed up even longer. Now, this morning, the nonprofit Free Press expressed this very same concern, as have others. And finally, I believe the bill includes an arbitrary definition of a covered platform. And again, other members have referenced this. It's no secret that this bill was designed to go after Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. But my question is, why are we concerned about just them in a competition bill that should be improving competition across industry? Why distinguish between Amazon Marketplace and Walmart Marketplace if the practices are comparable? A $10 billion company versus a $100 billion company, they both have economic significance. If the concern is that self-preferencing, the activity, the practice, is bad, when these few companies do it because of their dominance, then isn't it also bad when other large firms beyond these five adopt these same practices? So while I genuinely, trust me, I wholeheartedly embrace the premise of this bill in trying to rein in anti-competitive behavior by dominant tech firms, the bill, again, as currently drafted, doesn't quite completely hit the mark. But Mr. Chairman, sign me up for working to ensure that we address anti-competitive behavior in the tech sector, and sign me up for working with you and others to ensure that these large tech companies that play such a massive role in the daily lives of so many are well regulated by this committee and by active and well-funded regulatory agencies. Now, knowing that there's still a number of amendments to be considered and acted upon today, I'm not sure what my final vote will be today, but I do believe that regardless of the outcome, self-preferencing is an issue that needs to be addressed. And certainly, I'll look for some significant changes in addressing the issues I've outlined this morning to be addressed before I would consider supporting this measure on the floor of the Senate. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just for the record, I appreciated the words of my colleague. There is a standard, and the standard in the bill is more than that Senator Grassley and I have worked on over the year. More than 50 million U.S. consumer users, or more than 100,000 U.S. business users, over 550 billion in U.S. sales or market cap for public companies, or more than 30 billion in earnings for private companies, or more than 1 billion global users. And plus the characterization that they can restrict or materially impede access to customers. I only point this out because any company should grow into these standards. What we were targeting here were dominant platforms, and you could have a change in who that is over time. And we did not just specifically name companies.
And Mr. Chair, just quickly in response, I appreciate size of the company is a significant factor, but shouldn't market share be a different consideration? You can be a big company and have 5% of the market. You can be a big but not huge company and have 90% of the market. So that's part of the discussion and the debate here.
Well, none of these companies have 5% of the market.
Thank you, Senators. We have 4 senators seeking recognition in general remarks, and then we're going to move to anyone who wishes to offer an amendment. They are Cruz, Cotton, Blackburn, and Kennedy. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got several comments on this bill. First, a quick matter of housekeeping. I ask that on the first 4 judicial nominees that the committee considered that I be recorded as voting in person rather than by proxy.
Without objection.
On this bill, I want to start by commending Senator Klobuchar and Senator Grassley for their very hard work on this bill on a very complicated topic. I will say the discussion and debate we're having in this committee is nice and refreshing to actually see something resembling real debate on substance. It's something we as a committee and we as a Senate ought to do more often. I agree with many of the concerns that have been raised, and in particular, I would want to highlight, I think, the genuine and good faith concerns that Senator Lee has raised. That I believe are raised from a perspective of wanting a legal regime that makes sense and that functions and that doesn't create unintended consequences. I think those are concerns that should be considered carefully and given real weight. As I look at the bill, I agree in particular with the comments several people have made that when you look at big tech, there are a lot of abuses from big tech. Big tech are the robber barons of our modern age. And the power that has been aggregated in the hands of a handful of Silicon Valley billionaires exceeds any accumulation of power in the history of our country. It would make John D. Rockefeller blush to see the power today's big tech oligarchs wield. There are many abuses of that power. There are competitive abuses that hammer the little guy, that hammer small players, that leverage their monopoly power to produce massive profit windfalls. There are also censorship abuses, which many of us have raised. I've chaired multiple hearings on the censorship carried out by big tech. It is pervasive, it is malicious, and it is brazen. And Silicon Valley keeps getting worse and worse because no matter how egregious they get with censorship, they've discovered there are seemingly no limits and very few downsides to engaging in their self-declared role as the arbiters of what is allowed to be said and what is not allowed to be said. I think big tech censorship is the single greatest threat to free speech in America, and it is the single greatest threat to free and fair elections in America. And I wish this committee were addressing that problem directly and carrying through on our obligation to defend the constitutional rights of Americans, to defend free speech. I wish we were taking up directly a bill targeting big tech censorship, and I wish we had bipartisan agreement to do so. That's what we should be doing. We're not there yet. And this is not that bill. That being said, there are two things about this bill that I want to clarify that are my understanding of the language, and I want to say the manager's amendment that was filed, I think, improved the bill and improved the bill significantly. As the bill is drafted, I believe the bill would make some positive improvement as it concerns the problem of censorship. It doesn't protect consumers. I think it ought to protect everyone. This is targeted to businesses, so it is a subset of potentially impacted players. But as I read this statute, it would provide protections to content providers, to businesses that are discriminated against because of the content of what they produce. I think that is a meaningful step forward. That language is important. It's a protection that makes a difference to constituents in every one of our states. I'll say, secondly, numerous senators have pointed to potential unintended side effects, and I think we need to think about those carefully. I spent about 40 minutes on the phone yesterday with Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, who expressed significant concerns about the bill. One issue that he raised that I thought was a reasonable issue was a concern that the bill would would erect obstacles to Apple giving consumers the ability to opt out of apps monitoring what they're doing online, where they're going, what is occurring on their phone. And I want to clarify for the record that I don't read the language in this bill as applying to or as being intended to apply to tech companies giving consumers the ability to exercise choice or to opt out of privacy-invasive policies. The language of this bill, I believe, is entirely consistent with consumers being given the right to opt out, and I think we should give far more consumer choice. And so I don't believe this language creates an impediment to that practice, and I think we should see more empowerment of consumers to protect your individual consumer privacy. I filed several amendments to this bill. One amendment I filed to this bill is a speedy trial amendment. If you look at big tech, listen, most of us on this committee have been litigators. One of the key strategies of litigation, particularly if you're defense counsel, is to delay, bury your opponent in discovery, drag things out. I would note my home state of Texas has a lawsuit against Google, which unfortunately was transferred to a New York federal court where the practice of delay is ongoing right now. And big tech, in response to these suits from state AGs, from the federal government, their strategy, it ain't complicated, is to drag it out years and decades and hope that when we're all dead and buried, our grandkids will forget about whatever it was that was trying to be enforced against them. You know, I'm reminded of a great American lawyer and former Solicitor General of the United States, who just happened to be Senator Lee's father, who once wrote, quote, "There is a relationship between the quality of justice and the promptness with which it can be delivered." And he further wrote, "Judicial relief years after the event is seldom adequate." So this amendment is designed to prioritize these cases, to expedite them, to pose an impediment to the strategy we know big tech will engage in, which is delay, and drag it out. I also have a second amendment that allows for a private right of action, allows for those injured by the abuses of big tech to file lawsuits. Now, in this, I find myself in a curious position. It is usually my Democratic colleagues who are proposing private rights of action. And it is usually Republicans who are expressing concerns about additional litigation. I will say from my perspective, the abuses of big tech are so egregious that I am more than happy to unleash the trial lawyers. And that ought to at least pique the interest of a couple of Democrats on this committee. I think private causes of action can be tremendously effective in vindicating and enforcing rights. I recognize that some of the Republican sponsors of this bill have concerns with that, and I understand that. So I introduced a third amendment that was designed to be a middle ground, less than a private cause of action, which is allowing essentially qui tam type proceedings, private rights of action like the False Claims Act, that are brought by private litigants on behalf of the government and with the government's authorization. One of the challenges of taking on big tech is they have unlimited resources. And even government, whether it is the federal government or state governments, finds themselves dwarfed by the armies of lawyers that big tech can send in. I believe that creating a mechanism where there is a financial incentive for private litigation with a check, a quality check that it can't be unduly abusive, because just like a False Claims Act, the government has the ability to stop it if it's unduly abusive. I think that is a middle ground. I would note that Senator Grassley in particular has been a vocal supporter of the False Claims Act and using it. And my purpose in introducing this amendment was to find a middle ground that some of the Republican supporters of this bill would be willing to support, but that would add additional teeth to the enforcement mechanism. Because I do think it would be unfortunate for us to pass a bill directed at the abuses of big tech and have it lack the teeth, lack the force to actually be effective. I want us not only to address the abuses, but to solve them. I would note, by the way, also several members of this committee have said, well, gosh, why is it focused on the giant companies? Well, because they're the monopolists. We're not really concerned about the mom and pop store. Even if they engage in bad conduct, the mom and pop store doing so has really limited scope. But if you look at the thresholds in this bill, $550 billion, that ain't small. Even in the American economy, even in the global economy, those are massive numbers. And I think Senator Klobuchar is right that there are some companies that fall into it today, but they may not fall into it tomorrow. And there may be new ones. You know, there might have been a time when we would draft a bill directed at AOL. Well, that bill wouldn't make any sense anymore because AOL's no longer in a dominant position. The world of tech will change. This is designed to address dominant monopolists and to give meaningful constraints. Now, right now, my understanding is that the authors of this bill are not prepared right now to adopt these amendments. I'm going to refrain from offering these amendments. But Senator Klobuchar and Senator Grassley have both expressed a willingness to work with me in good faith to potentially incorporate these amendments. And I'm going to take their representations. I look forward to working with both senators on incorporating these amendments. And today I'm prepared to vote to move this bill along, to move it towards the floor. But whether or not this bill gets my support on the floor will depend on how we work together to incorporate these amendments. And I trust my colleagues will follow through on their commitments to work together to incorporate these. I think moving forward is a step that makes sense, and I'm prepared to vote that way today.
Thank you, Senator Cruz.
We have remaining Senator Cotton, Blackburn, and Kennedy. Senator Cotton.
I want to start by thanking and commending Senator Klobuchar and Senator Grassley for their work on this bill, and I appreciate their collaboration and cooperation with me and their teams with mine in a spirit of candor and frankness in trying to solve what is a real problem that's both before this hearing and their commitment to do so in the future. The bill does address a real problem. Big tech firms like Amazon routinely steal the intellectual property of small businesses that sell on their platforms and then produce knockoff versions of the same products for less, which they prioritize. These companies are abusing their market power, and I'm glad that Congress is finally addressing the problem. But I have three concerns with the bill. First, like many Arkansans and conservatives, I'm very concerned about big tech censorship, but I know that big government censorship would be worse, and I'm afraid that this bill leaves a lot of discretion to the Federal Trade Commission to define unfair conduct. I have real concern giving any agency that much power and discretion, especially an agency led by a callow ideological law professor like Lena Khan. Ms. Khan, you may remember, is a radical who thinks that antitrust shouldn't focus on consumer welfare at all, instead only focusing on destroying any market power wherever it may exist, even if it hurts consumers in the end, as long as it serves her ideological goals. Giving liberal bureaucrats more control over big tech is not only unlikely to fix the problem with censorship, it is more likely to make things worse. Second, I have concerns with provisions in the bill that could require data sharing between American companies and bad actors under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. I don't think that's the intent of the bill or the drafters based on our conversations, but I do think we can improve that language to make it safer for our companies and our citizens. And finally, while this bill applies to the companies we all know and recognize as big tech, companies like Apple and Facebook and Amazon, I think it also includes language that could catch up a lot of other firms that are nothing like these companies. Firms like Publix or Home Depot or Visa could be designated covered platforms under the bill, under the text of this bill as I read it. These firms, whatever you think of them or think of their business, are nothing like big tech firms, and they don't have the same kind of market power. They don't engage in the same kind of censorship. And I'm not comfortable potentially treating Kroger or Piggly Wiggly or Home Depot with the same kind of antitrust restrictions that we might expect on Facebook or Apple or Google. So I intend to oppose the bill today because of these concerns and because I think we could have taken more time to address them in committee. But again, I want to thank Senators Grassley and Senator Klobuchar for their commitment to work with me on these concerns as the bill moves forward towards the floor. I look forward to addressing these and hope to be able to support it because I do support its goals and see it pass on the floor of the Senate.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Cotton.
Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to commend Senator Klobuchar and Senator Grassley for the efforts that they have made. And I will add to, just as Senator Tillis did, I read Senator Klobuchar's book, and everyone ought to pick it up and give it a read. There's been a lot said about the actions of the House. And when I was in the House, we started on these issues 10 years ago. And whether it was at Energy and Commerce Committee, the work that we were doing there, trying to address privacy, cyber, data security, data portability, transfer rights, preferencing Section 230, there is a broad body of work from the House to try to address these things. And it was always a point of frustration with us that the Senate would not move forward to take it up. So I am thoroughly enjoying listening to this debate today. And I have enjoyed working with Senator Blumenthal to work on the app market bill and appreciate the work that we have had there. There are some problems that I do see with the legislation today. You know, I've got 5 amendments that I had drafted for this legislation. And I think it is important that we move forward with making certain the steps that we take to address monopolistic behavior in the virtual marketplace are going to be steps that do not impede competition, but encourage competition. There is not a business or an organization in the United States that does not have a virtual component. And making certain that innovation stays in place, that intellectual property rights are respected, that we address preferencing, that we address censorship, is something that needs to be done. Now, Senator Padilla mentioned the need for online privacy, and that is something that we are working on. We've held 5 hearings in Commerce Committee dealing with consumer privacy in the virtual space. How do you allow people to opt in? How do you preserve their right to opt out so that they know that they have the ability and the toolbox that is necessary to protect their virtual you? These are provisions that have languished and need the attention. But having broad conversations in a hearing today, in a markup today, about self-preferencing or about privacy or about monopolistic behavior does not replace the need for a more fulsome hearing on this legislation. At the proper time, I would like to offer the 2 amendments. One deals with a very brief change on evidence, requiring substantial evidence so that it comes into line with the Administrative Procedure Act. The other does a deal with portability, because I fully believe that we need to address data privacy and security on the front side of dealing with some of those issues. But, Mr. Chairman, I can tell very quickly that the opportunity for amending is going to be limited today. I do hope that we have the ability to continue to work on this before this legislation would move forward on the floor. And I thank my colleagues today for a very robust, respectful, bipartisan discussion on the topic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senator Kennedy, in wrap-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There seems to me there are a couple of things we can agree on today. Some of the companies that will be impacted by this bill are not companies, they're countries. Number 2, they're extraordinarily successful companies. They're breathtakingly successful, and they're American companies, and I'm very proud of them. Number 3, some of these companies are countries, not companies. Number 4, this bill doesn't address it, but some of these companies are killing fields for the truth. And their censorship is a threat to the First Amendment, as Senator Cruz pointed out. Number 5, I don't know if I mentioned this, but some of these companies are not companies, they're countries. And their business practices need to be looked at. Now, here's my suggestion. At least this is a start. As I said last time, for 5 years, the 5 years I've been here, all of us, myself included, with respect to address these issues that are in front of us every day, all we have done is strut around, issue press releases, hold hearings, and do nothing. So this is a start. Here's my suggestion, Mr. Chairman, for what it's worth. I suggest we move this bill out of this committee today. I suggest that the chairman, within the next 3 weeks, set a hearing. And I mean a real hearing that's going to start early and go all day and well into the evening. I think we ought to invite any of the companies that will be affected by this bill to come educate us. I think everybody should have a chance to have their questions answered. And the final point I will make, I'm a co-sponsor on this bill, but this bill is going to change. It's going to change dramatically, hopefully for the better. I expect to be in that room when these changes are made. Otherwise, I'll be off this bill faster than you can say big tech.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator
would it be possible for me to suggest, following up on what he said, we already have 82 amendments from Tillis that have to be considered after this bill gets out of committee, 2 or 3 from Blackburn, 3 from Cruz, and I don't know how many from Lee, 2 or 3, and from Senator, that we could just, this bill will never get 60 votes if we don't, we got to consider these things. So could we just move this bill now? And then we're going to have a lot of work anyway, and follow also Kennedy's suggestion.
Well, Senator Grassley, we're going to vote on this bill in this committee today.
Yeah.
Yes, and we
That's what I
will
said.
always be open to suggestions. A lot of the suggestions are conflicting, if you've noticed, which I know you know, because we've been working on this together. I truly appreciate more input from members and the thoughtful discussion that we've had, but I do think it's important that we have a vote today.
And I think that's what I suggested. Mr.
Exactly,
Chairman.
Senator Kennedy. Thank you.
It appears to me the question is not whether we're going to have a vote. We seem to have a general feeling we should.
Yeah.
I certainly feel that way. The question is whether we're going to have any amendments offered today. And that, in a markup, is up to the individual members.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cornyn?
Mr. Chairman, I would just say that all of us have seen this movie before, with the exception of I don't think I've ever actually had to vote on a bill or have a markup on a bill that did not get a hearing in front of the full committee and only in front of a subcommittee. That would be a precedent. Not a great precedent, but it would be a precedent. But the other part of that is we've got a lot of great ideas that have been offered here in the way of amendments, but if there's no opportunity to vote on those amendments here in the committee, the real risk is that we'll never get a chance to vote on any other amendments on the floor.
Well, Senator Cornyn, I'm happy to vote on your amendments.
Senator, I have the floor.
Well, put your amendments up. That's
There's
fine.
no,
Let's do it.
there's a very real opportunity. We've seen situations where if there's 60 votes for cloture and the majority leader fills the amendment tree, and that basically shuts out 40% of the United States Senate. So I just want us to be a little bit realistic and clear-eyed about our ability to shape this bill once it gets to the Senate floor. I know we're all busy and we want to get out of town, and there's a lot of ideas here, and the easiest thing to do is kick the can down the road, but what that means is that we may not have an opportunity to shape
please
this
offer
bill
your amendment.
at all. Senator,
Please.
I have the floor.
Okay, please offer your amendment. Let's go.
Senator, would you please refrain from interrupting me?
Okay, but I want to get moving for the
So I just want us all to be clear-eyed about the fact that 40 of us may not have any opportunity to shape this bill at all. And I think that's a problem in terms of the quality of the product, and I want to express those concerns. I do have an amendment, Senator, if you would like for me to offer. Senator Klobuchar seems anxious for me to offer my amendment.
If I might just comment, that it is not unprecedented for bills to move from subcommittee to full committee markup. That has happened It is not uncommon for bills to move from subcommittee to full committee markup. It's happened many times.
I'm not aware of any, but
We'll give you some documentation on that. Secondly, I want to make it clear that anyone who wishes to offer an amendment, this is your opportunity. I also want to make it clear that I stand behind Senator Klobuchar and Senator Grassley, I believe, that we're going to bring this to a final vote today, however long it takes. So if you're prepared to offer an amendment, now's the time, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, I would offer, call up my amendment S1L2220S. Mr. Chairman, I'm concerned about the potential national security consequences of this bill. I'm worried that it will harm American businesses and reward our adversaries, most notably the People's Republic of China. The last thing we should be doing is weakening America's ability to compete in a global economy. I worry that this bill, by disadvantaging American companies, will basically be a big gift to the People's Republic of China. It serves our homegrown companies up on a platter and does nothing to impact the bad conduct of our adversaries. So my amendment would provide protection to keep Americans' data out of the hands of the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party, and keep national security risk from having access to the internal workings of American companies or consumers. A major part of this bill is its requirements that the platforms, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, provide access to businesses that compete on its platform. In other words, notwithstanding the huge investment and the complexity and sophistication of these platforms, they have to offer access to businesses that don't share those characteristics. They haven't made any investments. They don't have the same level of sophistication, let's say even vetting for cybersecurity risks. They would also have to provide these businesses with the same kind of software, data, and other tools that the platforms provide themselves internally, again, over years of experience and investments. This has major national security issues. China, as we know, wants access to American consumer and business information. They are a vacuum cleaner when it comes to hoovering up data. Chinese companies under this bill would likely have the right to interoperate with the American platforms and have access to the features and the business data that are proprietary for these businesses. The bill has affirmative defenses for security reasons, and the manager's amendment created a very limited exclusion relating to the entities list, but these are not enough to address this concern. So my amendment would create a rule of construction that would make sure data on the covered platform would be transferred to China, that would prevent the covered platform from transferring information to China or other foreign adversary. Second, it permits the companies to make rules about their default settings in order to prevent data transfer to China or some other foreign adversary. And third, it redefines the kind of business who would be allowed access to the platforms, making sure entities that are clear national security risks or are affiliated with the People's Republic of China or the Chinese Communist Party or any other foreign adversary are not included.
Any further discussion on the Cornyn amendment?
Yes.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you, Chair Durbin, and thank you, Senator Cornyn. And I didn't mean to interrupt you before. I just wanted to make it very clear that we are open for amendments on the bill. I will oppose the amendment. I urge my colleagues to do the same. I understand the importance of this concern, and so we actually have a second-degree amendment that Senator Grassley and I have worked out on this. As I said, I share Senator Cornyn's concerns about maintaining data security, particularly when it relates to national security. I'm concerned that this amendment will not provide platforms or business users clear guidance. The amendment would change the national security provisions in the bill to prevent the transfer of data to businesses affiliated with China or another foreign adversary. But it is not clear whether a user who imports goods from China or who simply has a contractual relationship with a firm located in China, as many American businesses do, would qualify under the words in this amendment. An overly broad amendment like this could make it easier for platforms to skirt the rules. Adding vague terms to the bill just gives platforms that engage in anti-competitive practices more opportunities to say, well, we don't have to interconnect with this entity. We don't have to do anything with this entity. We don't have to do anything with this entity, and to say the rules don't apply to them. The changes that Senator Grassley and I made in the manager's amendment that you have all reviewed would address this concern quite precisely. We added provisions that make clear that the bill does not apply to conduct that prevents data sharing with people or businesses that are subject to U.S. sanctions or export control regimes or has been identified as national security, intelligence, or law enforcement risks. This is language that we reviewed with the Department of Justice, Senator Feinstein, and provides greater clarity about the range of people or businesses that have been identified by national security professionals as presenting a risk to national security, intelligence, or public safety. I urge my colleagues to preserve that language and vote against the amendment. And we also have distributed the second-degree clarification to SIL 2205. And that second-degree amendment addresses the overbreadth in SIL 22305. That would be the Cornyn Amendment. This amendment, the second degree, clarifies that it only covers data transfers to the Communist government of China or to governments of other foreign adversaries or to business users controlled by the Communist government in China or the governments of other foreign adversaries. And I urge my colleagues to support this second degree amendment.
Mr. Chairman, can I briefly respond? And then I'll be happy to have a vote.
Senator Cornyn.
Mr. Chairman, the protections that Senator Klobuchar discussed simply will not work when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China. On December the 10th, 2020, the Wall Street Journal talks about the policies of the Communist Party in China and notes that in September, that would be September of 2020, the party issued new guidelines for private companies, reminding them to serve the state and vowing to use education and other tools to continually enhance the political consensus. In other words, private businesses that operate in China are not truly private. Secondly, China in 2017 passed a Chinese national intelligence law that requires organizations and citizens doing business in China to support, assist, and cooperate with state intelligence work. In other words, private companies operating in China are not purely private companies, but have to cooperate with the intelligence services of the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China. Lest you think I was cherry-picking from these two sources, let me just cite a Homeland Security bulletin entitled Data Security Business Advisory. On page 4, they point out that the Chinese Communist Party also collects foreign data to enhance its national security and geopolitical interests. This is by the Department of Homeland Security. Stolen intellectual property has been essential to the modernization of the People's Liberation Army, equipping it with advanced warfighting and information capabilities. The Chinese Communist Party utilizes foreign data as a tool to map the activities, relationships, status, and vulnerabilities of key individuals, including PRC dissidents. Foreign data collection informs CCP efforts to monitor global sentiments, such as criticism of human rights abuses surrounding the treatment of minority ethnic groups like the Uyghurs or Kazakhs, and to develop new propaganda tools and messaging to inject its preferred narratives into global discourse and suppress speech. So, Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent that these articles be made part of the record. And I would just say that notwithstanding the best efforts of the sponsors of this legislation, they will not work when it comes to the relentless ability and willingness of the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China to vacuum up private data and use it for its own purposes.
Without objection, the articles will be entered into the record. Pending before us now is a second-degree amendment by Senator Klobuchar and Grassley to the Cornyn Amendment. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak to the second-degree amendment? Now, the question is on the adoption of the amendment. Does the senator seek a roll call or?
No.
You want a roll call, Senator Cornyn? Please. The clerk will call the roll on the second-degree amendment offered by Senators Klobuchar and Grassley to the Cornyn Amendment.
Mr. Leahy. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye by proxy.
Ms. Klobuchar.
Aye.
Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Ms. Verona. Mr. Booker. Aye. Mr. Padilla. Aye. Mr. Azad. Aye. Mr. Grassley.
Aye.
Mr. Graham.
No by proxy.
Mr. Cornyn.
No.
Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Cruz.
No by proxy.
Mr. Sass.
No.
Mr. Hawley. Aye. Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy. No. Mr. Tillis.
No by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn. Chair Durbin.
Aye. Senator Whitehouse votes in person.
Chair Durbin, on this, ayes are 13, the nays are 9.
So the substitute amendment offered by Senators Klobuchar and Grassley is adopted and part of now the Cornyn Amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I believe it was a second-degree amendment.
You're exactly right. I'm sorry I said that wrong. Second-degree amendment was adopted and is now part of the Cornyn Amendment as amended. And the question is on the adoption of that amendment. All those in favor say aye. Roll call.
Roll call.
Senator Cornyn asks for a roll call on the Cornyn Amendment as amended with the Klobuchar-Grassley substitutes. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye.
Ms. Klobuchar.
Aye.
Mr. Mr. Graham. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Sass. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Tillis. Mrs. Blackburn. Chair Durbin. Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 22, the nays are 0.
So the Cornyn Amendment as amended is adopted. Any further amendments? Senator Lee.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to call up my amendment number 22032. This amendment represents what I think is a simpler, safer, and more effective solution to the problem of big tech abuse. When I look at this bill, I see it doing primarily two things. First, it abandons market definition and monopoly power concepts. And second, it prohibits a broader range of conduct than is addressed by our antitrust laws. Now, when it comes to big tech, I'm actually open to the first change. The second change, however, risks, I fear, doing more harm than good by putting the government in charge of this issue and putting the government in the position of picking winners and losers and punishing competitors for conduct that other competitors may dislike, but that happens to be good for consumers. This amendment, number 22032, would simply retain the definition of covered platform and state that in any suit against such a platform alleging a violation of the Sherman Act, a court shall presume that the covered platform has monopoly power for purposes of establishing liability. These businesses sit at the nexus of speech and commerce in the 21st century, while being protected by massive network effects and barriers to entry. We don't need to establish a specific market share in order to demonstrate their control over industries that they dominate. Now, if we had more time and if we weren't dealing with attendance issues, I might be offering more. I might be seeking more roll call votes. What I would like to do is hold off on calling a roll call vote on this one, but address another amendment. If I can direct your attention to number 22153. And I am going to want to call for a roll call vote on this one. I'm concerned, and this concern is reflected in Amendment 22153, that the affirmative defenses in the bill are hollow. They end up unintentionally, but decidedly amounting to sort of window dressing and lack any real substance. To avail itself of any affirmative defense under the bill, a defendant has to show that conduct was, quote, narrowly tailored and non-pretextual. Now, asking someone to prove a negative in order to avoid prosecution, in order to avoid enforcement action by the government, is, in my view, in this context, a meaningless protection. This is not how things work. I've also never seen one in which you're required to establish that it's narrowly tailored. I mean, this is borrowing language from other contexts, as if from the strict scrutiny context in constitutional law. Here, neither of these terms really belongs here. So the amendment simply removes the phrase "was narrowly tailored, comma, was non-pretextual" from the affirmative defense requirements. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like a roll call vote on this.
Mr. Chairman? Right here, Mr. Chairman.
Senator
Down at
Ossoff.
the very end. Yeah.
Thank you.
Your
lips weren't moving.
Appreciate the amendment that Senator Lee has offered here, which I think gets to a core area of ongoing discussion about this legislation. And let me first express my appreciation and admiration to Senator Klobuchar, Senator Grassley, and yourself, Mr. Chairman, for your efforts to address these egregious abuses ongoing in this sector. Striking the appropriate balance between privacy and cybersecurity in this legislation is important. And what I want to offer as a second-degree amendment, Senator Lee, to yours, is that we toughen the standard slightly that these tech companies have to meet in order to invoke this affirmative defense where privacy or security functionality is concerned, by retaining the word non-pretextual, which Senator Klobuchar wrote into the underlying bill, such that these firms have to demonstrate when they're defending themselves on grounds that the feature or practice protects privacy or security, that defense is non-pretextual, that is in fact the first and genuine intent motivating whatever practice is being challenged by DOJ or a state attorney general. This, I think, will hold these companies to a higher standard and find the balance that this committee continues to seek between the very important competition policy concerns and the very real cybersecurity and data privacy concerns.
Senator Ossoff, are you offering an amendment?
Yeah, I have a second-degree amendment here, which...
To the Lee amendment?
To the Lee amendment.
22153.
That's right here.
And you're going to distribute that amendment?
We need to have it.
It's coming to the desk.
I need to see a copy of it. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, while he's distributing that, could I speak to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, would you please be clear on what we're voting on?
I'd be happy to. Certainly, we're voting on amendments to the bill. An amendment offered by Senator Lee, which basically strikes the bill and sets off on a different course.
No, that's not at all what it does.
Well, I'll let you describe it. I'm just trying to put it into a category.
No, just to be clear, Mr. Chairman, this is not the initial amendment that Senator Lee discussed but then declined to request a roll call vote. This is the second amendment that he wished to discuss, which gets specifically to the affirmative defense with respect to privacy and security.
I misspoke. It's on its way. I understand. But specifically, we're dealing with a second-degree amendment offered by Senator Ossoff to the Lee amendment, correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
You reinsert the term pretextual.
I reinsert the term non-pretextual in order to hold the tech companies to a slightly higher standard, such that when they are invoking security and privacy as an affirmative defense against action from a state attorney general, they must demonstrate that the functionality or feature which is being challenged or practice which is being challenged is non-pretextually serving the ends of privacy or security. I share Senator Lee's broader concern, and I think that what the committee is doing right now is trying to find the appropriate balance between security and privacy, which are vital to all of us who believe that this sector demands more regulation, and the competition concerns addressed by the underlying bill.
So let's start with Senator Lee, whose amendment is being amended.
If I can just speak very briefly to it. I appreciate the insight of my friend and colleague from Georgia, Senator Ossoff. I appreciate his agreement with me on the point that we ought to remove narrowly tailored. I also believe we should remove non-pretextual. In some ways, the non-pretextual language might be the more offending one. In any event, what he's doing is he wants to strike my striking of the word non-pretextual. I don't believe that ought to be a condition precedent for raising an affirmative defense. You're dealing here with enforcement actions brought by the government. It's not consistent with the way our legal system typically works to give government these very broad, aggressive enforcement powers and then provide for an affirmative defense, but require as a condition precedent for establishing that affirmative defense to prove a negative. If the affirmative defense isn't warranted, it ought to be the government's burden to prove that the affirmative defense was raised in a manner that's not acceptable because it was pretextual.
I would.
Chairman,
go ahead.
Can I
Right as we do.
just ask a technical question about this amendment? Senator Lee's amendment proposes that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words be stricken, correct, Senator Lee? Senator Ossoff's amendment removes one of those words, so presumably it would no longer be stricken. But if you adopt Senator Lee's amendment, then all the language around it would still be stricken. And so now you have this free-floating word, pretextual, without any context to it. So I don't think we actually have a grammatically correct amendment before us at this point.
If I could just comment on both of these senators' work, I believe this would upset the careful balance that the bill draws to addressing anti-competitive conduct while still allowing platforms. Senator Grassley and I have worked on this for months, while still allowing platforms to show that their actions were reasonably necessary to protect privacy or security.
Any further debate on the Ossoff second-degree amendment?
Look, I'll just close with this, Mr. Chairman. The committee is working here to strike that balance between privacy and security and competition policy. Senator Lee's offered an amendment that weights the bill more toward privacy and security, and what I'm proposing is that we toughen the standard a bit that these companies have to meet, that they should demonstrate that privacy and security-oriented policies are offered non-pretextually, that they're not merely a fig leaf for anti-competitive conduct, but that they are, in fact, earnestly in good faith and principally about protecting user privacy and security, which are vital functions and policies that many consumers want.
Would Senator Ossoff take a voice vote, or do you want a roll call?
Like a roll call vote.
So the question is on the second-degree amendment offered by Senator Ossoff to Senator Lee's amendment, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse. No. Ms. Klobuchar.
No.
Mr. Coons.
No by proxy.
Mr. Blumenthal. No. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Ossoff.
Aye.
Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
No by proxy.
Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz.
No by proxy.
Mr. Sass.
No by proxy.
Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Tillis.
No by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn.
No by proxy.
Chair Durbin.
No.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 3, the nays are 19.
The Ossoff second-degree amendment is not agreed to. The question now arises on the Lee amendment.
Mr. Chairman, can I speak just 15 seconds on that before we do a roll call vote on my amendment? My amendment is directed at one of many issues. It reflects a certain degree of confusion, confusion that we've seen echoed right now. We have not had a robust process. All discussions on this have been behind closed doors. We can do this. We can do it in a way that is collegial and that resolves confusion. But there is confusion surrounding things like affirmative defenses that are unusual, that are novel, that have not been tested and don't fit. This amendment deals with one of those, and I'd urge your support on it. Thank you.
The clerk will call the roll on the Lee amendment.
Senator Leahy.
No by proxy.
Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse. No. Ms. Klobuchar.
No.
Mr. Coons.
No by proxy.
Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Ossoff.
Aye.
Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Mr. Lee. Aye. Mr. Cruz.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Sass.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Tillis.
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn.
Oh, aye by proxy.
Chair Durbin.
No.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 10, the nays are 12.
The Lee amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments to come before the committee? I don't know what she said. Oh, I see. Where I understand Senator Blackburn is returning. Anyone else have an amendment they wish to offer? Senator Lee?
Yeah. I've got an amendment that deals with an issue. got an amendment that deals with the designation issue in Section 3D of the bill. I consider it somewhat unthinkable. We would allow for 2 agencies to have authorities to simply declare which companies are covered by the law while making it nearly impossible to appeal that decision. And this bill does that. And so that's why I've got an amendment to deal with it. What's the section? There's not a number. And so I've got a motion to strike Section 3D because the designation process is either duplicative on the one hand or it's a loophole on the other. And either assessment demands its removal.
Senator Lee, do you have a number on that amendment?
This is just a motion to strike. I don't know what the number is. Hang on just a moment. Oh, we do not have a number on it. It's just a motion to strike.
You may proceed with the motion to strike. And would you please describe this section one more time?
Section 3D of the legislation.
Could you indicate what is struck?
Yeah.
Section 3D.
Yeah. This is a section that allows either of these 2 federal agencies, to Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission, to simply declare which companies are covered by the law. And then, in addition to doing that, in addition to giving them this power to designate who's covered by it, it makes it nearly impossible to appeal that very decision.
Senator, could you, oh, we do have it now.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Feinstein?
It's my understanding that, is this on page 20 and 21 of the bill?
Yes, it appears.
Does it in effect strike everything on page 20 from either line 14 or 20 to what page?
It looks like.
Line 17, page 22. Is everything struck between those 2 points by this?
Yes.
By the way, I bet we may have just mapped out where this actually ends up.
Senator, I don't think I'm in a position to characterize the amendment. Perhaps someone else is.
That allows FTC to add.
I believe what Senator Feinstein says is correct. This would damage the entire bill.
Or revenue criteria?
If I could respond to that question, it would retain the authority that they've got to deal with those entities that are designated as covered by the statute. What it removes, and it is a relatively narrow portion of the authority that it removes, but it's a significant issue because this would give these 2 entities, Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, power to designate additional covered entities, additional corporate entities that will be subject to the restrictions of this law, even if they're not listed and specifically covered by the statute. So this is a discretionary act that has dramatic, deeply impactful significance for any affected entities. So this is just, it's weird. It's a very weird provision. I think it's dangerous to put it in there and then make that designation virtually impossible to appeal.
I just believe that knowing with certainty if you're going to be covered or not is very important to this bill, and I think people would agree that companies need to know.
Absolutely, and that's one of the reasons why they need to know, and that's why one of the reasons why I think it's better to go with statutory definitions. You do have statutory definitions, so look, you can't have it both ways. This thing is either, if they're already defined, then it's duplicative. if they're not already defined and you're giving added discretion to them to add other entities not covered by the legislation, then it's a really weird loophole. But either way, this provision, 3D, needs to be stricken.
This is not a loophole. It's same standards that they have to prove in court.
If it's not a loophole, then it's duplicative.
If there's no further debate to come before the committee, the question is on the Lee motion to strike. And on that motion, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
No by proxy.
Mrs. Feinstein. No. Mr. Whitehouse.
Nope. Sorry, I don't like this. I'm voting aye to strike.
No. The motion is to strike. The vote no to not.
No to the amendment.
No.
Ms. Klobuchar.
No.
Mr. Coos.
No by proxy.
Mr. Blumenthal. No. Ms. Serrano. No. Mr. Booker. No. Mr. Padilla. No. Mr. Asa. No. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
No by proxy.
Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Mr. Lee. Aye. Mr. Cruz.
No by proxy.
Mr. Sass.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Tillis. Mrs. Blackburn. Chair Durbin.
No.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the yeas are 6 and the nays are 16.
The motion to strike is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cornyn?
Mr. Chairman, you'll be glad to know this is my last amendment. I'd call up S1L222123. This has to do with cybersecurity. I think we've all learned that unvetted access to data, hardware, and services raises cybersecurity concerns. Not every potential user will want to interoperate with a platform, or that does want to interoperate with a platform will have the level of cybersecurity that Americans deserve. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the National Security Agency, and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security have issued a joint threat alert warning that Chinese state-sponsored cyber actors target the United States repeatedly. I think that's common knowledge. This bill would make those targets more vulnerable. So my amendment would make sure the requirements of this bill don't lead to the exploitation of cybersecurity vulnerabilities by foreign actors.
Any discussion related to Cornyn Amendment 22123?
Very briefly, Chair Durman, I'll oppose this amendment. I urge my colleagues to do the same. This amendment would add an overly broad carve-out and allow platforms to restrict the availability of data when the platform determines on its own that it's a significant risk. The bill already includes provisions that we have worked on in discussions with the platforms and security experts to focus on security that addresses this issue. The bill states that conduct that, quote, protects safety, user privacy, the security of non-public data, or the security of the covered platform does not violate the Act, even if it materially harms competition. To make it explicitly clear, Senator Grassley and I included in the manager's amendment provisions clarify that the bill's rules do not require covered platform operators to interoperate or share data with person or business users that are subject to U.S. sanctions or export control regimes or have been identified as national security, intelligence, or law enforcement risks. I believe Senator Cornyn's amendment would create a loophole in the bill to allow platforms to justify a wider array of anti-competitive conduct in the name of protecting cybersecurity. This amendment would upset the careful balance that the bill draws to protect national security while still preventing conduct that harms competition.
Mr. Chairman, may I just briefly respond?
Senator Cornyn.
I think what Senator Klobuchar is referring to is an affirmative defense. And for the non-lawyers on the committee, that means you're guilty unless you can prevail on your affirmative defense. I think it's important enough to protect the cybersecurity of American consumers that we need to have this protection on the front end, not as an affirmative defense.
I have said all that I will say.
Any further
and I know
discussion?
Senator Grassley supports me.
Any further discussion relative to the Cornyn amendment? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
No by proxy.
Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse.
No.
Ms. Klobuchar.
No.
Mr. Coons.
No by proxy.
No by proxy, I'm sorry.
Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Sass.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cox.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Tillis. Mrs. Blackburn. Chair Durbin.
No.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 11, the nays are 11.
Could I be recorded?
Senator Leahy will be recorded as present and voting no. And it's a tie vote, I understand?
Yeah.
The amendment is not agreed to. Is there any further amendment to come before the committee? Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to call up my amendment, HEN 22045. And this deals with the insertion of the term substantial before the word evidence for agency deference in Section 3D3B of the Manager's Amendment. One of the things that we consistently discuss is having lack of specificity for federal agencies, and then they'll go about how they're going to implement things through the rules. And as we are finally beginning to look at big tech governance, I think it is important to make this simple change because the Administrative Procedures Act requires substantial evidence for deference to agency findings of facts. So at a minimum, we should do the same thing. I think by failing to do so, we create the risk of allowing the FTC or DOJ to designate companies for enforcement without just a minimal showing under the antitrust laws. So I ask for a vote on the amendment.
On amendment HEN 22045, any discussion?
Briefly, I appreciate, as
Klobuchar.
I've said, Senator Blackburn's work on the App Store bill. I do oppose this amendment. Senator Blackburn's amendment would raise the standard for government federal enforcers when they designate a dominant platform as being covered by the bill. The bill currently requires a court to defer to an agency's factual determination that a platform should be covered by the bill if it is supported by evidence. This deference is based on trust in our antitrust enforcement agencies. This amendment would increase that burden and require the agency's determination to be supported by substantial evidence. And as we know, by the way, by attempts made even during the Trump administration to do something about these platforms, it has been very difficult. Let's be clear that this determination does not attach any liability or civil penalty. All we are talking about here is a determination that a platform meets the requirements in this bill, that it is a dominant platform that serves as a critical trading partner. I don't think we should be tying the hands of enforcers right out of the gate. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment.
Any further discussion on the Blackburn amendment? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy.
No.
Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse.
Nope.
Ms. Klobuchar.
No.
Mr. Coons.
No by proxy.
Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Harona. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla.
No by proxy.
Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
No by proxy.
Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Lee.
I by proxy.
Mr. Cruz.
I by proxy.
Mr. Sass.
I by proxy.
Mr. Hawley. Mr. Cotton.
I by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
I by proxy.
Mr. Tillis.
Aye.
Mrs. Blackburn.
Aye.
Chair Durbin.
No.
Chair Durbin, on this vote, the ayes are 9, the nays are 13.
The amendment is not
Chair.
agreed to. Any further amendments?
Mr. Chair, I just asked Senator Blackburn if we could work on her additional amendments in the future so we could have a vote on the final bill. At some point, people are waiting to vote, and I really do appreciate it, and I pledge to you I'll work with you as well as get our App Store bill up.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I'll hold the other amendment.
I'm sorry, what'd you
I'll
say?
withdraw the other amendment.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Are there any other amendments to come before the committee on this bill?
Mr. Chairman, just a brief comment. On the last two amendments, I think there's merit further discussion. I voted no because I think we should have these move, but I think these are worthy of further discussion as we go into the next phase. But I would like to support Senator Klobuchar in getting this bill voted on and out of here today.
If there are no further amendments, we will vote on final passage on the bill. Do you wish for a roll call, Senator Klobuchar?
I don't need a roll call, but if someone wants one, we can have one.
You want one?
Yeah. Don't you want a roll call vote or not?
I don't need a roll call vote if we just want
Then
to.
let's just have a voice.
We
Senator
have a
Cornyn
request
asked
for a
for
roll call. The clerk call the roll.
Mr. Leahy. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye.
Ms. Klobuchar.
Aye.
Mr. Coons.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Harona. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla.
Aye by proxy. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I didn't see a signal from the staff. Someone here? Aye by proxy.
Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Grassley.
Aye.
Mr. Graham.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Lee.
No by proxy.
Mr. Cruz.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Sass.
No by proxy.